Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey into a world you thought you knew, Christmas. But not the Christmas of twinkling lights and shopping malls. No, we're going back, way back. To a time when winter meant darkness, real darkness, and the celebration we now call Christmas was something far stranger, far more primal, and infinitely more fascinating than anything you've ever imagined. We're talking about the Dark Ages, and trust me, what people did in the depths of December back then would absolutely shock you. So, before we step into this ancient world together, I need just one small thing from you. If you find yourself pulled into this story, if you feel that little tingle of curiosity, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. Give this video a like when something surprises you, and honestly, I'd love to know, where are you watching from right now? Are you in bed already? On your couch? Maybe it's raining where you are, or maybe you can see snow outside your window. Drop a comment and tell me. I read every single one, and I love knowing that we're all scattered across the world but connected by these stories. Now, dim those lights if you haven't already. Get comfortable. Let the world outside fade away. Tonight, we're travelling back about 1500 years to a time when the longest night of the year wasn't just a date on a calendar, it was a matter of survival. Picture this. It's late December, somewhere in northern Europe. Let's say the year is 650 AD. You're living in a small wooden dwelling, and the sun, that precious, life-giving sun, has been disappearing a little more each day for months now. By late December, you're getting maybe 7-8 hours of weak daylight at most. The rest, darkness. Cold, penetrating darkness that seeps into your bones and makes you wonder if the sun will ever truly return. Now, I want you to really imagine this because it's almost impossible for us to understand today. You have no electricity, no streetlights, no flashlight on your phone. When night falls, it's not just dark. It's a darkness so complete that you can hold your hand in front of your face and see absolutely nothing. The only light comes from your fire, and keeping that fire burning is literally a matter of life and death. Let it go out, and you might freeze before morning. Your whole family gone. So you can imagine how people felt about the winter solstice, the longest night of the year, usually around December 21st. This wasn't some cute astronomical event to mark on your calendar. This was the turning point, the absolute bottom of the year's descent into darkness. And on the other side of it, if you made it through, the days would start getting longer again. The sun would return. Life would return. For thousands of years before Christianity ever reached northern Europe, people celebrated this moment with everything they had. The Norse people called it Yule, and Yule wasn't a gentle, peaceful holiday. It was raw, intense, and deeply connected to survival. The celebration started when your father and brothers went out into the frozen forest to find the largest log they could drag home. We're talking a massive chunk of tree trunk here. This was the Yule log. And when I say large, I mean this thing was supposed to burn for 12 days straight. 12 days. Can you imagine the size of that log? They'd haul it back home, probably taking hours, their breath freezing in the air, their hands numb despite the work. Then, on the longest night, they'd light it. The whole family would gather around as the flames caught and began to consume this enormous piece of wood. And here's something beautiful. The Norse believed that every single spark that flew up from that fire represented a new animal that would be born in the coming year, a new pig, a new calf, more food, more wealth, more life. So children would sit there, counting the sparks, and each one was like a tiny promise that spring would come again. that the darkness wouldn't last forever. But Yule wasn't just about the Norse. All across Europe, different cultures were doing their own versions of this same desperate, hopeful celebration. Down in Rome, they had Saturnalia, a week-long festival honouring Saturn, the god of agriculture and harvest. And let me tell you, Saturnalia was absolutely wild. For 1 week, usually from December 17th to the 23rd, the entire social order of Rome flipped upside down. Slaves were temporarily freed. They could say whatever they wanted to their masters. They could demand to be served at table. The masters, these wealthy, powerful Romans who literally owned other human beings, had to wait on them, had to listen to them mock and insult them, and you couldn't complain. It was Saturnalia. The Roman poet Catullus called it the best of days. Schools closed, courts shut down. Business stopped. Everyone wore these informal dining clothes called synthesis instead of their normal togas. People exchanged gifts, usually candles, which represented light and hope, or little pottery figurines called sigillaria. And the gambling. Romans gambled like crazy during Saturnalia. Dice games were illegal the rest of the year, but during this festival, go for it. Lose your savings. Who cares? The world is upside down anyway. There was this beautiful, chaotic freedom to it all, a sense that, at the darkest, coldest time of year, humans needed to break all the rules, to laugh in the face of winter and death, to remind themselves that yes, we're still alive, and yes, we're still here. Meanwhile, up in the Celtic regions, Ireland, Scotland, Wales, parts of France, people were doing something similar but with their own unique twist. The Celts were deeply connected to nature, and they saw the winter solstice as a battle between the Oak King, who represented summer and light, and the Holly King, who represented winter and darkness. At the solstice, the Oak King would defeat the Holly King, and light would begin its slow return to the world. The Celts brought evergreen plants, holly, ivy, mistletoe, into their homes. Think about that for a second. In the dead of winter, when everything is brown and dead and frozen, these plants are still green, still alive. They're proof that life continues even in the darkest times. That's powerful symbolism. And mistletoe? Oh, mistletoe was sacred. The Druids, the Celtic priests, believed it had magical powers because it grows on oak trees without having roots in the ground. It just appears there, suspended between earth and sky. They thought it could cure diseases, protect against evil, help women become pregnant. They'd harvest it with a golden sickle during sacred ceremonies, being careful never to let it touch the ground and lose its power. So you've got all these different cultures, Norse, Roman, Celtic, and dozens of others, all doing variations of the same thing. They're burning fires, they're bringing greenery into their homes, they're feasting on whatever food they've managed to save or slaughter, they're getting drunk, they're singing, they're temporarily forgetting about the hierarchy and rules that normally control their lives, and most importantly, they're trying to coax the sun back into the sky. Because that's what this was really about. It wasn't just a party. It was a deeply religious, deeply spiritual moment where humans looked at the dying world around them and said, no, we refuse to accept that this is the end. The light will return. Life will return. We will survive this. Now here's what's so fascinating. None of these celebrations had anything to do with Jesus Christ. Nothing. Zero. Christianity was still mostly confined to the Mediterranean and Middle East during these centuries. It hadn't really penetrated Northern Europe yet. These winter festivals were pagan, meaning they weren't part of any of the major monotheistic religions. They were older, more primal, tied to the earth and sky and the very basic human need to make sense of a terrifying, beautiful, mysterious world. The pagans who celebrated Yule and Saturnalia and all the rest. They didn't know they were laying the groundwork for Christmas. They didn't know that a few centuries later, Christian missionaries would arrive and slowly, carefully, deliberately absorb all these traditions into a new holiday celebrating the birth of a Jewish carpenter's son in Bethlehem. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Right now, we're still in the pagan world, and I want you to feel what it was like. You're sitting in your small home, probably shared with your extended family and maybe even your animals, because keeping them inside helps everyone stay warm. The Yule log is burning. Your stomach is actually full for once because you've been saving food for this feast. There's probably some kind of fermented drink, ale or mead, making its way around the circle. Everyone's faces are illuminated by the firelight, shadows dancing on the walls. Outside, the wind howls. Snow is probably falling. Wolves might be prowling somewhere in the darkness beyond your door. But in here, in this small circle of light and warmth, you feel something like hope. The year is turning. The sun is coming back. You're going to make it. And someone starts singing. Maybe it's an old song about the gods, about Odin riding across the winter sky with his ghostly hunt. Or maybe it's something simpler. Just a rhythmic chant that helps mark the time, helps everyone feel connected, part of something larger than themselves. This is where Christmas came from. Not from a church, not from a Bible verse, but from this. From humans huddling together in the darkness, creating light and warmth and community and hope out of nothing but their will to survive and their refusal to surrender to winter's grip. The ancient peoples didn't see winter as a neutral season. They saw it as an enemy, a force that wanted to kill them. And these celebrations, these were acts of defiance. These were humans shaking their fists at the sky and declaring, "We're still here, and we're not going anywhere." So when Christian missionaries finally did arrive in places like England, Germany, Scandinavia, when they started trying to convert these pagan peoples to Christianity in the 5th, 6th, 7th centuries, they walked into communities that already had deeply meaningful winter celebrations, traditions that had been practiced for thousands of years, beliefs that were woven into the very fabric of people's lives. And those missionaries faced a choice. They could try to stamp out these pagan traditions entirely, tell people to abandon everything they'd ever known and replace it with this new religion from a faraway desert land. Or they could do something more clever, something more strategic. They could absorb the old traditions, rebrand them, give them new Christian meanings while keeping the familiar rituals that people loved. And that's exactly what they did. But that story, the story of how Christianity deliberately took over the winter solstice and transformed it into Christmas, that's a tale of politics, power, and brilliant strategy that we'll explore in our next part. We'll see how a Roman Pope made a decision that would change Christmas forever, and how the old pagan gods never truly disappeared. They just got new names and found new hiding places in the holiday we celebrate today. For now, though, just sit with this image. A dark winter night, 1,500 years ago. A massive log burning in the hearth. Families gathered together. The smell of roasting meat and wood smoke. Ancient songs in languages we no longer speak. And the unshakable human belief that no matter how dark it gets, light will always return. That's the foundation of Christmas. That's where it all began. In darkness, in hope, and in the eternal human need to find meaning in the coldest, darkest night of the year. Rest easy tonight, knowing that you carry within you the same DNA, the same spirit as those ancient people. The same capacity for hope in darkness, the same ability to create light where there is none. And when we return, we'll discover how the Church waged a centuries-long campaign to take this pagan celebration and make it Christian, a campaign so successful that most people today have no idea Christmas was ever anything else. So here's where our story takes a fascinating turn, one that involves political manoeuvring, religious strategy, and a decision that would echo through the next 2,000 years of human history. We left off in that ancient pagan world, where winter solstice celebrations had existed for millennia. Now we need to talk about how Christianity, a religion that started in the warm deserts of the Middle East, ended up claiming December 25th as its own. And let me tell you, this wasn't some divine revelation. This was pure, calculated strategy. The year is 336 AD. We're in Rome, but it's not the Rome of gladiators and conquering legions anymore. That empire is crumbling. Christianity, once a persecuted underground movement, has suddenly become legal thanks to Emperor Constantine just 2 decades earlier. And now the Church faces its biggest challenge yet. How do you convert an entire empire full of pagans who absolutely love their winter festivals? Enter Pope Julius I. Now Julius was nobody's fool. He looked at the situation and recognized something crucial. You can't just tell people to stop celebrating the most important festival of their year. You can't walk into a Norse village where families have been lighting Yule logs for 1,000 years and say, "Stop that, it's evil." They'll laugh at you, or worse. So Julius made a decision that was either brilliant or cynical, depending on how you look at it. He declared that Jesus Christ was born on December 25th. Now, let's pause here because this is important. Nobody, and I mean nobody, actually knows when Jesus was born. The Bible doesn't give us a date, not even close. In fact, most biblical scholars today will tell you that Jesus was almost certainly not born in December. The Gospel of Luke mentions shepherds watching their flocks in the fields at night, which wouldn't happen in December. It's too cold, and the sheep would be sheltered. Most historians think Jesus was probably born in spring or early fall, maybe around September. But Julius wasn't concerned with historical accuracy. He was concerned with conversion rates, and he realized something genius. If you place the birth of Christ right on top of the winter solstice, right on top of Saturnalia, right when people are already gathering to celebrate and feast and light fires, well, then you don't have to fight those traditions. You just rebrand them. Think about it from a marketing perspective. You're a Roman citizen in the year 340 AD. You've celebrated Saturnalia your whole life. Your parents did, their parents did, going back generations. It's the best week of the year. Then some Christians come along and say, "Good news, you don't have to give up your December festival. You just need to celebrate it for a different reason now. Instead of honouring Saturn, you're honouring Jesus. But you can still feast, still give gifts, still light candles, still get drunk and party. Sound good?" For a lot of people, that was an easy sell. But here's what makes this even more interesting. It wasn't just Julius making this decision in a vacuum. There was actually a competing holiday that Christians were trying to override. The festival of Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun. Emperor Aurelian had established this festival in 274 AD, about 60 years before Julius's decision. December the 25th was designated as the birthday of Sol Invictus, and it was hugely popular, especially among Roman soldiers. The symbolism was powerful. At the darkest moment of the year, the sun begins its return. The unconquered sun defeats the darkness, every single year, without fail. Do you see the problem? From a Christian perspective, people are worshipping the sun, a created object, instead of the Creator. That's idolatry. That's exactly what Christianity is fighting against. but the festival is so popular, so deeply ingrained, that you can't just ban it. So what do? You give people a new sun to worship. Jesus becomes the light of the world. He becomes the Sun of Righteousness mentioned in the Old Testament. The symbolism transfers perfectly. Same date, same themes of light conquering darkness, same sense of hope and rebirth. But now it's all Christian. It's actually pretty clever when you think about it. Maybe a little manipulative, but clever. Now, this strategy worked brilliantly in Rome and other parts of the Mediterranean. But Northern Europe? That was a different story. That's where things got really interesting and really messy. Christianity didn't reach places like England, Germany and Scandinavia until much later. We're talking the 6th, 7th, 8th centuries. And when missionaries finally did arrive, they encountered pagan populations who were way more resistant to conversion than the Romans had been. These weren't urbanized, literate people who could be persuaded by theological arguments. These were tribal societies with warrior cultures. Their gods weren't abstract concepts. They were Odin, Thor, Freya. Gods who fought and drank and schemed and had personalities. Gods who felt real and present. The most famous missionary to these northern lands was a man named Boniface, later known as Saint Boniface. He was an English monk who spent decades in what's now Germany, trying to convert the Germanic tribes. And one of his biggest frustrations, which he wrote about in letters that survive to this day, was that people kept celebrating in pagan style. In 742 AD, Boniface wrote a complaint to Pope Zachary describing what he was seeing. People were singing, dancing, performing what he called heathen songs and sacrilegious acts. During December, during what was supposed to be the solemn Christian season celebrating Christ's birth, people were running around with animal masks, cross-dressing, basically doing all the chaotic Yule traditions they'd always done. And Boniface was like, make them stop. But here's the thing, they couldn't make them stop. The church tried. Oh, they tried. They issued edicts. They threatened excommunication. In some places, they even threatened violence. But these traditions were too old, too beloved, too deeply woven into the cultural fabric. So eventually the church adopted a different strategy. The same strategy Julius had used 400 years earlier. If you can't beat them, absorb them. There's a fascinating letter from Pope Gregory the Great, written around 601 AD, where he gives explicit instructions to a missionary named Augustine who was heading to England. Gregory tells him, and I'm paraphrasing here, don't destroy the pagan temples. Convert them into churches. Don't ban the pagan festivals. Just give them new Christian meanings. Make the transition as smooth as possible. It's all right there in writing. The church's official policy was cultural absorption, not cultural destruction. And so that's what happened. The Yule log? That became a Christian tradition. You're still bringing light and warmth into your home, but now you're doing it to honour Christ, the light of the world. The evergreen decorations, those became Christian too. They represent eternal life through Jesus. The feasting, now you're celebrating God's bounty and the incarnation of Christ. Even the date itself got a bit of Christian backstory. Church scholars came up with this elaborate calculation based on the idea that Jesus was conceived on March 25th, the spring equinox, and therefore must have been born 9 months later on December 25th. Never mind that this doesn't align with the Gospel accounts. It gave a theological justification for the date, and that was good enough. But here's what I find most fascinating. The pagan elements never really disappeared. They just went underground. They got disguised. They got Christianized on the surface, but if you looked closely, you could still see the old gods peeking through. Take Santa Claus, for example. We think of Santa as a Christian figure, Saint Nicholas, but look at him closely. An old man with a white beard who rides through the sky on the longest nights of winter, coming down chimneys, judging who's been naughty or nice. That's not St. Nicholas. That's Odin. That's the Norse god who rode across the winter sky during Yule on his 8-legged horse Sleipnir, leading the wild hunt, a ghostly procession of the dead. The Norse used to leave offerings of food out for Odin and his horse during Yule. Children would put their boots by the fireplace filled with straw for Sleipnir to eat, and Odin would leave them gifts in return. Sound familiar? We still do this. We just call him Santa now and give him reindeer instead of an 8-legged horse. Or look at Christmas trees. The church tried for centuries to ban the practice of bringing trees indoors and decorating them because it was so obviously pagan. But people kept doing it anyway, especially in Germany. Eventually, the church gave up and created a Christian story to explain it. Something about Martin Luther seeing stars through tree branches and being inspired. But the real origin? Germanic tribes who believed trees housed spirits and brought them inside during winter to protect those spirits from the cold. Even the 12 days of Christmas. That's not a Christian invention. That comes from the 12 nights of Yule. The church just slapped the name of Christian feast days onto those 12 days and called it their own. What's happening here is something anthropologists call syncretism, when two religious traditions blend together. And medieval Christmas is one of the most perfect examples of syncretism in human history. You've got this new religion, Christianity, trying to establish itself in territories where old pagan religions have existed for thousands of years, and instead of replacing the old religion entirely, you get this hybrid, something that's nominally Christian but is absolutely saturated with pagan beliefs and practices. The really wild part? Most Christians at the time knew this. They weren't confused about what was happening. They understood that a lot of Christmas traditions came from pagan sources, but they didn't care. Or rather, they felt that Christianity was strong enough to absorb these traditions and transform them. There was this attitude among medieval church leaders that went something like, yes, the pagans used to do this to honour their false gods, but now we're doing it to honour the true God. We've redeemed these practices, we've baptised them essentially. And you know what? For the most part it worked. By around the year 1000 AD, the High Middle Ages, Christmas had become the most important celebration in the Christian calendar across most of Europe. Bigger than Easter even. The pagan origins were still there. Still visible if you knew where to look, but they'd been successfully absorbed into Christian framework. But, and this is crucial, the Christianity that emerged from this process wasn't the Christianity of the early church. It wasn't the Christianity of Jesus and the apostles. It was something new, something uniquely medieval, something that would have been almost unrecognizable to a Christian living in Jerusalem in 50 AD. It was a Christianity that was comfortable with excess, with feasting, with drinking, with chaos and misrule. A Christianity that had made peace with some very unchristian behaviours as long as they happened during this special season. A Christianity that looked a lot more like the pagan festivals it had absorbed than like anything you'd find in the New Testament. And that created some problems. Because now you had priests who were supposed to be setting an example of Christian piety, but during Christmas they were getting drunk and cross-dressing and eating black pudding at the altar. You had the Feast of Fools, where junior clergy would mock their superiors and perform sacrilegious parodies of the Mass. You had people who went to church on Christmas morning and then spent the next 11 days in a state of almost continuous intoxication. The church had successfully Christianized the winter solstice, but in doing so, it had created a holiday that was barely recognizable as Christian at all. So as we move forward, we're going to explore what Christmas actually looked like during the Dark Ages, what people ate, what they drank, how they behaved, and I promise you it's going to surprise you. It's going to make modern Christmas look tame by comparison, because medieval Christmas wasn't about silent nights and holy calm. It was about noise, chaos, rule-breaking, and indulgence. It was about the world turning upside down for 12 days while everyone pretended that this was all somehow honouring the birth of Christ. The political marriage between Christianity and paganism had been arranged. The papers were signed. But the wedding night, well, that's where things got really interesting. Let me take you back to something that might seem strange to us now, but was absolutely central to medieval Christmas. The act of deliberate starvation. Yes, you heard that right. Before medieval people could feast, they had to fast. And I'm not talking about skipping breakfast or doing some trendy intermittent fasting. I'm talking about 40 days of genuine grinding hunger. 40 days of denying yourself the foods you craved most. 40 days of watching your body weaken while winter tightened its grip around you. This was Advent. And to understand medieval Christmas, you have to understand that everything, the feasting, the drinking, the chaos we're going to explore, all of it was amplified 1,000 times over because people had been starving themselves for more than a month. The fast officially began on November 11th, the Feast of St. Martin of Tours. That's why in medieval times they didn't call it Advent. They called it the 40 Days of St. Martin. And from that day until Christmas morning, Christians were expected to follow strict dietary rules that would make modern vegans look like gluttons. Here's what you couldn't eat: meat from any animal that lived on land. So no beef, no pork, no chicken, no lamb. Nothing. You also couldn't have eggs. No milk, no butter, no cheese. Basically, if it came from an animal that walked or flew, it was forbidden. Now you might be thinking, okay, so they ate fish and vegetables for 6 weeks. That doesn't sound so bad. But remember where we are. This is medieval Europe. It's November and December, the absolute dead zone of the agricultural calendar. There are no fresh vegetables. Everything that was going to grow has already been harvested back in September and October. What's left is whatever you managed to preserve over the summer, and those stores are running low because you've been eating from them since last Christmas. So realistically, your Advent diet consisted of dried fish, usually herring or cod that had been salted and hung up to preserve it, some dried peas or beans, maybe some turnips or parsnips if you were lucky, and bread made from whatever grain you had left. That's it. Day after day after day. The same dried, bland, monotonous food. No variety, no richness, no fat to make you feel satisfied, and you were expected to eat less of it than normal. That was the whole point. You were supposed to feel hungry. You were supposed to suffer a little bit. This was penance. This was preparation. You were emptying yourself out so that when Christmas came, you could be filled. The church had very specific theological reasons for this. They saw Advent as a mirror of Lent, the 40-day fast before Easter. Just as Jesus had fasted for 40 days in the wilderness before beginning his ministry, Christians were supposed to fast before celebrating his birth and his resurrection. It was about discipline, self-control, demonstrating that you could master your bodily desires in service of your spiritual growth. But let's be honest about what this really did to people. It made them absolutely ravenous. Imagine you're a peasant farmer in England, maybe around the year 800 AD. You've been working hard all year, ploughing fields, planting crops, harvesting them. Your body is used to hard physical labor and needs substantial calories to function. But now it's late November, it's cold. Your body wants to store fat for the winter, but instead you're eating less than usual. And not just eating less, you're eating food with almost no fat content, no animal protein, nothing that really satisfies. By the time you get to mid-December, you're obsessed with food. You dream about it. You think about it constantly. What you're going to eat on Christmas morning, how it's going to taste, that first bite of meat after 40 days without it, the richness, the satisfaction. The wealthy had it a little easier, I should mention. If you were rich, you could afford imported dried fruits, dates, figs, raisins. You could have nuts. You might even have access to expensive spices that could make your bland fish and vegetables taste a bit better. And there was a loophole that the rich exploited shamelessly. Barnacle geese. Oh, this is such a wonderful bit of medieval logic. There was a widespread belief that barnacle geese, these birds that migrated to Scotland and Ireland every winter, weren't actually born from eggs like other birds. People believed they grew out of barnacles attached to driftwood or ship hulls. They'd never seen the birds' breeding grounds up in the Arctic, so they came up with this explanation. And if barnacle geese grew from barnacles which live in the sea, then technically these birds weren't land animals, they were sea creatures, which meant you could eat them during Advent without breaking the fast. The church went back and forth on this. Some bishops said no, obviously geese are birds, this is ridiculous. Others looked the other way. But if you were wealthy enough to afford barnacle goose during Advent, you could at least pretend you were following the rules while eating significantly better than everyone else. For most people, though, Advent was genuinely hard, and it got harder as you got closer to Christmas, because the final day of the fast, Christmas Eve, was the strictest of all. This was a full fast day, meaning you weren't supposed to eat anything until after midnight mass. Some people interpreted this as eating nothing until after dawn on Christmas Day. Can you imagine? You've been eating a restricted diet for 39 days, and now on the 40th day, you're supposed to eat nothing at all. Meanwhile, you're preparing the Christmas feast. You're slaughtering animals, cooking food, and the smells are filling your house, but you can't eat any of it. There's a beautiful irony here. The church created this system to teach discipline and self-denial, but what it actually did was make people absolutely insane with anticipation. It turned Christmas into the most intense, eagerly awaited celebration imaginable. Not because of the religious significance, though that mattered too, but because people were literally starving, and the psychological impact went even deeper than physical hunger. Advent took place during the darkest, coldest part of the year. The days were short, the nights were long. You were stuck inside most of the time because it was too cold and dark to do much outdoor work. You were probably living in close quarters with your entire extended family, everyone getting on each other's nerves. Resources were tight. Everyone was irritable from hunger and cold and cabin fever. Medieval sources describe Advent as a time of melancholy, a time when people felt the weight of winter pressing down on them, a time when the darkness felt almost oppressive, and the fasting made all of that worse. You had less energy, you felt weaker, more vulnerable, more aware of your mortality. There's a medieval poem, I wish I could remember the exact source, that describes Advent as the season of waiting in darkness. And that's exactly what it was. You were waiting, enduring, holding on, trusting that the light was coming, that the feast was coming, that relief was coming, but you couldn't see it yet. You just had to have faith. Now, the church tried to make Advent a spiritually meaningful time, not just a time of physical suffering. The 40 days were supposed to be spent in prayer, in reflection, in attending extra church services. Advent Sundays were special. Each Sunday there would be particular Bible readings and hymns that built anticipation for Christ's birth. And for some people, monks, nuns, truly devout lay people, this spiritual aspect was real and meaningful. They genuinely used Advent as a time to deepen their faith, to meditate on the Incarnation, to prepare their hearts for Christmas. But let's be real. For most people, the spiritual preparation was secondary to the physical hunger. They went to church because they were supposed to. They said their prayers, but mostly they were just counting down the days until they could eat properly again. And here's what made the whole system even more intense. The church told people that breaking the Advent fast was a serious sin, not a minor slip-up, a real sin that could endanger your soul. There were consequences, penance, public shaming in some communities, so you had this enormous pressure to comply even when you were desperately hungry, even when the smell of your neighbor's cooking was driving you crazy, even when every fiber of your being was screaming at you to just eat something, anything, with some actual substance to it. Some people cheated, obviously. Human nature hasn't changed, but the social and religious pressure to maintain the fast was real. And for 40 days, most people genuinely did restrict their diets in ways that would be almost unthinkable to us today. Do you know what your body does when you fast for that long? Your metabolism slows down. Your stomach actually shrinks a little bit. You become more sensitive to flavors because your taste buds aren't being constantly overwhelmed. And most importantly, your brain starts producing different neurotransmitters. You enter a slightly altered state of consciousness. Some people report feeling lightheaded, having vivid dreams, being more emotional than usual. Now imagine an entire community, an entire region, an entire continent of people all in this same altered state. All hungry, all cold, all dark, all waiting, all building up this enormous pressure of anticipation that's about to explode on Christmas morning. That's the context we need to understand what happened next. Medieval Christmas wasn't just a religious festival. It wasn't just a cultural tradition carried over from pagan times. It was a release valve for 40 days of pent-up hunger, frustration, darkness, and desire. And when that valve finally opened, when the church bells rang at midnight on Christmas Eve, when people heard the priest declare that the fast was over, that the Christ child was born, that it was time to feast, the explosion was spectacular. People didn't just eat, they devoured. They didn't just drink, they got obliterated. They didn't just celebrate, they went absolutely wild. Because after 40 days of discipline, after 40 days of self-denial, after 40 days of hunger in the darkness, they had earned this. They had paid their dues, and now, for 12 glorious days, all bets were off. But before we get to that feast, before we dive into the absolute chaos of medieval Christmas celebration, we need to talk about Christmas Eve itself, that final night of waiting, that liminal space between fasting and feasting, between darkness and light, between the old year dying and the new year being born. Because Christmas Eve in the Dark Ages wasn't just another day. It was a night when the veil between worlds grew thin, when supernatural forces were abroad, when anything could happen. It was a night of terror and wonder in equal measure, and that's where our story goes next. There's something about twilight on Christmas Eve that still feels magical even now. But in the Dark Ages, that liminal hour between day and night, between the old world and the new, was absolutely charged with supernatural energy. And I mean that quite literally. People genuinely believe that Christmas Eve was when the boundaries between our world and the other world became dangerously thin. You're standing outside your dwelling as the sun sets on December 24th, maybe around the year 750 AD. You've been fasting all day. Nothing has passed your lips since yesterday. Your stomach aches with hunger, but that's not what's making your heart race. It's the darkness. It's coming on fast now, swallowing the landscape, and with it comes something else. A presence, a watching. Inside, someone's already started preparing the fire. Not just any fire. This is the moment when the Yule log gets lit, that massive trunk your family dragged in days ago. But there's a ritual to it that we haven't talked about yet. See, that log can't just be any piece of wood. It has to be ash, if possible. Ash wood was considered sacred, connected to Yggdrasil, the world tree in Norse mythology. And it absolutely cannot be bought. It has to be given as a gift or taken from your own land, because buying it would bring bad luck for the entire coming year. The log is decorated before it's lit. Holly berries, ivy, perhaps a sprig of mistletoe if someone was brave enough to climb up and cut it down with a proper ceremony. Each plant has a purpose. Holly, with its sharp leaves and blood-red berries, wards off evil spirits. Ivy represents fidelity and eternal life. And mistletoe, that's the most powerful of all. Now, I mentioned mistletoe briefly before, but I didn't tell you why the Druids considered it so sacred. It grows on oak trees without roots in the earth. It just appears there, suspended between heaven and ground, living on air and dew. In Celtic belief, anything that existed between two states was inherently magical. Mistletoe was neither tree nor plant, neither rooted nor free-floating. It belonged to two worlds at once, and Christmas Eve was exactly the same. Neither Advent nor Christmas, neither the old year nor fully the new, a threshold moment, a between time. And in between times, the rules that normally govern reality become flexible. The Yule log is lit with a piece saved from last year's log, creating an unbroken chain of fire stretching back generations. As the flames catch and grow, everyone in the household gathers around. This isn't just for warmth, though God knows it's cold. This is protection, light against darkness, life against death. Because once night falls completely, you don't want to be outside. Have you ever been somewhere so dark that you literally cannot see your hand in front of your face? Most of us haven't. We have street lights, house lights, phone screens, but medieval darkness was absolute, oppressive, and on Christmas Eve that darkness was believed to be full of things that wished you harm. The wild hunt was abroad. We touched on this earlier when we talked about Odin, but let me paint you the full picture now because it's genuinely terrifying. The wild hunt was a spectral procession, a storm of ghosts and demons and the restless dead, led by a supernatural figure that different cultures called different names. In Germanic lands, it was Odin himself, riding his 8-legged horse Sleipnir. In England, it might be Herna the Hunter. In Wales, Gwyn ap Nudd, king of the fairies. But whoever led it, the hunt was the same. A thundering cavalcade of spirits racing across the winter sky, hunting souls. You'd hear them before you saw them, the baying of spectral hounds, the thunder of hooves that shook the ground, the wild shouts of the hunters. Medieval sources describe the sound as terrifying, like a storm and a battle and a scream all at once. And if you were unlucky enough to be outside when the hunt passed, several things could happen, all of them bad. Best case scenario, you hid. You threw yourself on the ground, covered your head, and prayed they'd pass over you. If they did, you might escape with just a memory of soul-crushing terror that would haunt you for the rest of your life. Worst scenario, you looked up. You made eye contact with one of the riders. In that case, you'd be marked, cursed. You might sicken and die within the year, or you might be driven mad, your mind broken by what you'd seen. Worst scenario, the hunt would sweep you up. You'd be caught in their whirlwind and carried away, and your body would be found miles from home. dead of fright or exposure. Or maybe it wouldn't be found at all. Maybe you'd become part of the hunt yourself, condemned to ride with them every Christmas Eve for eternity. These weren't just stories. People genuinely, truly believed this. There are court records from medieval times of people refusing to travel after dark during the Christmas season, even for emergencies. There are accounts of entire villages staying indoors from sundown to sunrise, doors and windows barred, prayers muttered continuously until dawn. And it wasn't just the wild hunt. Christmas Eve was when all sorts of supernatural beings were at their most powerful and most dangerous. Trolls came down from the mountains, ghosts walked, shapeshifters prowled, the boundaries of the fairy realm dissolved, and beings from that other world could slip through into ours. In Iceland, the folklore was particularly dark. There's a saga called the Grettir's Saga that I mentioned earlier, and it contains this genuinely chilling Christmas Eve story. A shepherd named Glamour is watching his master's sheep when he's attacked and killed by a troll on Christmas Eve, but death doesn't end the story. Glamour comes back as a Draugr, a sort of Norse zombie, and terrorizes the community for years afterward, killing more people on subsequent Christmas Eves. The saga describes him as enormously strong, with a face so terrifying that anyone who looked at it would lose their courage forever. He could grow larger at will, and no weapon could wound him. Eventually the hero Grettir fights him and manages to destroy him, but even in death, Glamour curses Grettir, dooming him to see Glamour's eyes in the darkness for the rest of his life. A curse that essentially drove Grettir to madness. These stories were told on Christmas Eve. Can you imagine? You're sitting around that fire, hungry and exhausted from fasting, the wind howling outside, and someone's telling you about murderous undead shepherds who might be lurking just beyond your door right now. But here's the fascinating thing. The fear wasn't entirely separate from the celebration. They were intertwined. The terror of Christmas Eve made the joy of Christmas morning more intense. The darkness made the light more precious. The very real sense of supernatural danger made the safety of home and hearth and community more meaningful. And the church? They knew about all these pagan beliefs, of course. They tried to Christianize them, to give them new explanations. The wild hunt became God's judgment on sinners. The trolls and fairies became demons. But they couldn't eliminate the fear, and I don't think they really wanted to. Fear served a purpose. It kept people coming to church. It kept them praying. It reinforced the idea that they needed the church's protection against the forces of darkness. So as Christmas Eve night deepened, families would huddle closer to their fires. They'd hang more holly around the doors and windows. They'd tell stories, some frightening, some comforting. Someone might play a simple instrument, a lyre or a flute, soft music to ward off the silence, and they'd wait for the church bells. In larger towns and villages there would be a church, and on Christmas Eve that church would hold midnight mass. This was the most important service of the entire year, not Easter Sunday, not any saint's feast day. Christmas Eve Mass was the pinnacle of the religious calendar. The church would be prepared for days ahead of time. Every available candle would be lit, dozens of them, maybe hundreds if the church was wealthy enough. Holly and ivy would decorate the altar and the pillars. The priest would have prepared his best vestments. This was spectacle. This was theatre. This was the moment when heaven and earth touched. The service would start around 11 at night, building toward the magical moment of midnight when Christ was believed to have been born. People would leave their homes in groups, carrying torches, moving through the dangerous darkness together. There was safety in numbers, and the light of the torches formed a barrier against whatever might be lurking out there. Inside the church, the warmth of all those bodies and all those candles would be overwhelming after the cold outside. The smell of incense, frankincense and myrrh if the church could afford them, cheaper herbs if not, would fill the air. And the music. Oh, the music. Medieval Christmas carols weren't the gentle, soothing songs we know today. They were powerful, rhythmic chants designed to fill a stone building with sound. In Dulci Jubilo is one that survives from this era, a macaronic carol, meaning it mixed Latin and vernacular German, making it accessible to everyone while still maintaining that air of sacred mystery. The congregation would sing together, hundreds of voices united, and in that moment you'd feel it. Connection, community, the sense that you weren't alone in the darkness, that all of you together were stronger than whatever lurked outside those walls. The priest would give his sermon, usually short because people were hungry and exhausted, and then comes the culmination, the declaration of Christ's birth. The bells would ring, not a gentle tinkling, but a full triumphant peal that shattered the darkness. Every bell in the tower, ringing out across the countryside, announcing to everything, humans, spirits, demons, God himself, that the light of the world had been born. And that's when the transformation happened. Suddenly Christmas Eve was over. It was now Christmas Day. The fast was broken. The danger had passed. The long Advent was finished. People would stream out of the church. But now they weren't afraid. The bells had driven away the wild hunt. The birth of Christ had pushed back the darkness. It was safe now. More than safe. It was time to celebrate. Some families would go straight home to eat. They'd been preparing the feast for days after all, and it just needed to be served. Other communities had the tradition of the lord of the manor or the wealthiest family in the village hosting an immediate post-mass feast, providing food and drink to everyone who attended the service. But before anyone ate, there was one more ritual, the wassail. The word wassail comes from Old Norse veshail, meaning be healthy or be fortunate, and wassailing on Christmas Eve was part blessing, part toast, and part negotiation with nature itself. Someone, usually the eldest or most respected member of the community, would take a bowl of warm spiced ale or cider and go out to the apple orchard. Yes, even in the middle of the night, even though moments before no one would have dared step outside. But Christmas had arrived now. The rules had changed. They'd pour some of the wassail at the roots of the oldest, most productive apple tree. They'd offer a toast to it, sometimes in song. Here's to thee, old apple tree, whence thou mayest bud, and whence thou mayest blow, and whence thou mayest bear apples enow. They believed this would ensure a good harvest of apples next year, and then they'd pass the wassail bowl around, everyone drinking from it, the warm alcohol hitting their empty stomachs like a fire, spreading heat and joy and relief through their bodies. This is the moment. This right here. When the supernatural terror of Christmas Eve transforms into the supernatural joy of Christmas morning. When the longest night finally breaks. When fasting becomes feasting. When fear becomes celebration. And what comes next? The food, the drink, the absolute explosion of indulgence. Well, that's something we need to explore in detail. Because medieval people didn't just eat on Christmas morning. They ate like they might never eat again. They drank until they couldn't stand. They celebrated with an intensity that would shock our modern sensibilities. The feast is about to begin. The smell hits you first. That's what would have overwhelmed you if you'd walked into a medieval home on Christmas morning. The aroma of roasting meat after 40 days without it. Can you even imagine what that would do to your senses? Your mouth watering so intensely it almost hurts. Your stomach cramping with anticipation. Every cell in your body screaming, finally. But we need to talk about the stark reality of medieval Christmas feasting, because it looked very, very different depending on whether you were sitting at the high table of a castle or huddled around a peasant's hearth. The gap between rich and poor was astronomical, and nowhere was it more visible than in what people ate on Christmas Day. Let's start at the top. Let's talk about what a royal Christmas feast looked like in the Dark Ages, because the historical records that survive are almost unbelievable. King John of England held a Christmas feast in 1213. Now, John was not a popular king. We're talking about the villain from Robin Hood here, the guy who'd later be forced to sign the Magna Carta. But whatever his faults as a ruler, the man knew how to throw a party. The administrative records from that feast still exist, and the numbers are staggering. 400 head of pork. Just sit with that for a second. 400 pigs, slaughtered and prepared. 3,000 chickens, 15,000 herring, 10,000 eels, 100 pounds of almonds, 2 pounds of various spices, 66 pounds of pepper alone, and to wash it all down, 27 hogsheads of wine. That's roughly 7,000 bottles in modern measurements. This was for a single day. One feast. And remember, this is 1213, which is technically late medieval period, but the tradition extended back centuries into the Dark Ages. Kings like Charlemagne, Alfred the Great, and others before them held similarly lavish Christmas celebrations. But here's what's fascinating. This wasn't just about gluttony. This was political theatre. When a king held a massive Christmas feast, he was making a statement. He was demonstrating his wealth, yes, but more importantly, he was demonstrating his generosity. In medieval society, a good king was supposed to be a generous king. He was supposed to share his abundance with his people. So these royal Christmas feasts weren't exclusive affairs where only the nobility ate well. No, the great hall would be open to knights, soldiers, servants, local worthies, and often even common people from the surrounding area. Not everyone ate the same food, mind you. There was definitely a hierarchy to the seating and the dishes, but everyone ate something. The high table where the king and his most important guests sat would have the truly exotic items. Peacock, for example. And peacock wasn't just roasted and served. Oh no, that would be far too simple. The bird would be carefully skinned, keeping all its iridescent feathers intact. Then the carcass would be roasted with spices, and then, and this is my favourite part, the cooked meat would be sewn back into the original skin, with the tail feathers fanned out in full display, and the whole thing would be presented to the table looking like a living bird made of gold and jewels. It was pure spectacle. The peacock would be carried into the hall in a procession, maybe with musicians playing, definitely with everyone in the hall turning to look. And the meat itself, apparently it tasted pretty awful, tough and gamey and not really worth the effort. But that wasn't the point. The point was the display, the demonstration of wealth and power. The boar's head was another showstopper. Wild boar was prized in medieval times, dangerous to hunt, delicious to eat, and symbolically significant. The boar represented courage, ferocity, winter itself. To defeat and consume a boar was to triumph over the harsh season. The boar's head would be boiled until tender, then decorated with herbs and placed on a massive platter. Sometimes they'd put a lemon or an apple in its mouth. The eyes might be replaced with berries or nuts. And then it would be carried into the hall while everyone sang the Boar's Head Carol, a song that still exists today, though most people don't know it anymore. The lyrics are gloriously medieval. The boar's head in hand bear I, bedecked with bays and rosemary, and I pray you, my masters, be merry, quote Estis in convivio, as many as are in the feast. It's both solemn and celebratory, both pagan and Christian, both ancient and immediate. Swan was another delicacy reserved for the highest tables. Swans belonged to the crown in England. It was actually illegal for common people to eat them. They were considered royal birds, elegant and pure. And unlike peacock, swan actually tasted quite good, rich and dark, somewhat like duck but more complex. But let's step away from the high table now, because most people weren't eating peacock and swan. Let's talk about what the average person, a free peasant, maybe a craftsman in a town, someone who worked hard but wasn't destitute, would eat on Christmas morning. First and foremost, goose. Christmas goose was the tradition for centuries before turkey ever arrived from the Americas. Geese were common, relatively affordable, and genuinely delicious. A family might have been raising their goose since summer, fattening it up specifically for Christmas. And on Christmas morning, after 40 days of no animal fat, no rich meat, no satisfying food, that goose would taste like the most magnificent thing they'd ever eaten. It would be roasted over the fire, the fat dripping down and sizzling, the skin crisping to golden perfection. The smell would fill the entire dwelling, and when it was finally ready, when they finally carved into it and took that first bite, the richness, the salt, the fat coating your tongue and throat, that was heaven. That was literally what they imagined heaven tasted like. Alongside the goose, there might be pork. Remember, November was slaughtering season. Pigs that couldn't be fed through winter were killed in late autumn, and the meat was preserved, salted, smoked, made into sausages or bacon or ham. Christmas was when you'd break into those stores and actually cook the good stuff, not just the scraps. Black pudding was another Christmas staple. For those who don't know, black pudding is blood sausage. Pig's blood mixed with fat and oats or barley, stuffed into intestines and cooked. It sounds unappetizing to modern ears, but in medieval times, when you couldn't afford to waste any part of an animal, blood pudding was precious. Rich in iron, dense with calories, incredibly satisfying after a long fast. There'd be bread, of course, but not the coarse, dark bread of everyday meals. Christmas bread might be made with finer flour, maybe with some honey or dried fruit mixed in if the family could afford it. Some regions had special Christmas bread traditions, braided loaves, round loaves decorated with religious symbols, loaves baked with a coin or bean hidden inside for luck. Ale was essential. Medieval ale wasn't like modern beer. It was thicker, less carbonated, sometimes almost porridge-like. It was made by women in their homes, and it was a staple of the diet year-round. But Christmas ale was special. Brewed in late autumn specifically for the Christmas season, it might be spiced with herbs, sweetened with honey, stronger than usual, the good stuff that you'd been saving. For dessert, and yes, medieval people had dessert, there'd be simple treats. Nuts if you'd gathered them in autumn, apples from storage, maybe baked with honey and cinnamon if you were lucky enough to have spices, dried fruits like raisins or figs if you had the money, and for the truly fortunate, mince pies. Medieval mince pies weren't like the ones we have today. They actually contained meat, usually mutton or beef, minced and mixed with dried fruits, suet and spices. They were shaped in rectangles to represent Christ's manger, and the spices, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, were meant to symbolize the gifts of the Magi. There was a superstition that you should eat one mince pie on each of the 12 days of Christmas for good luck in the coming year. But now we need to address the elephant in the room, or rather, the people not in the room. Because for every family that had goose and ale and mince pies, there were families that had almost nothing. The truly poor, the landless labourers, the beggars, the widows and orphans, They didn't have geese they'd been raising all year. They didn't have stores of preserved pork. They were utterly dependent on charity, on the generosity of others. And this is where medieval Christmas gets interesting from a social perspective, because there was this deeply ingrained belief, both Christian and holdover from pagan times, that the wealthy had an obligation to feed the poor during Christmas, not as a nice gesture, as an obligation. The lord of the manor was expected to hold a feast for his tenants, not the fancy peacock and swan affair he'd have with his noble friends, but a real feast with meat and drink for the people who worked his lands all year. If a lord failed to provide this, he'd be considered miserly, ungodly, possibly even dangerous to the social order. There are medieval texts that explicitly state that a lord who doesn't feed his people at Christmas is inviting rebellion and divine punishment. Churches collected food and distributed it to the poor. Wealthy merchants and craftsmen would provide meals for their apprentices and workers. Monasteries opened their doors to travellers and the destitute, offering food and shelter throughout the 12 days of Christmas. This wasn't pure altruism, though we might like to think it was. It was partially religious duty. Jesus said to feed the hungry, clothe the naked, shelter the homeless. But it was also social insurance. Medieval society was incredibly stratified and unequal. The poor vastly outnumbered the rich, and one of the key mechanisms for preventing the whole system from collapsing into violence was these moments of ritualized generosity, these times when the wealthy demonstrated that they cared, that they would share, that the social compact held. Christmas was the biggest and most important of these moments. For 12 days, theoretically, no one should go hungry. In practice, of course, plenty of people still did. But the ideal was there, and enough wealthy people followed it that the system functioned. There's a beautiful, or maybe tragic account from a monastery in France, I believe it's from the 9th century, describing their Christmas charity. They prepared a massive pot of stew, vegetables, some meat scraps, grain, and when they opened the monastery gates on Christmas morning, hundreds of people were waiting. Hundreds. More than they'd expected, more than they'd prepared for, and the monks diluted the stew with water again and again, trying to stretch it to feed everyone, until what they were serving was barely more than flavoured water. But they kept serving it because to turn people away on Christmas would be unthinkable. That tension between the abundance of the royal feast and the watered-down charity stew, that was medieval Christmas in a nutshell. Massive inequality, but also real, meaningful attempts to bridge that gap, at least temporarily. And the food wasn't just about sustenance, it was about identity. What you ate told everyone who you were. The king ate peacock and swan, the knight ate venison and boar, the freeman ate goose and pork, the poor ate whatever charity provided. Food was status made visible and edible. But here's the beautiful thing. On Christmas, all that food was sacred. Whether you were eating roast swan at the high table or a bowl of charity stew by the monastery gate, you were participating in the same celebration. You were breaking the same fast. You were marking the same moment. The birth of Christ, the return of light, the survival of another year. The table, whether it was an actual table or just a spot on the floor, became a holy place. The food became more than food. It became communion in the deepest sense of that word. Common union, being united with others in the act of eating, of surviving, of celebrating. And after people ate, after the initial desperate hunger was satisfied, after stomachs were full for the first time in weeks, that's when things really got interesting. Because medieval people didn't just feast quietly and go to bed. Oh no, the eating was just the beginning. The drinking was about to intensify. The games were about to start. The rules of normal society were about to be suspended, and for 12 glorious, chaotic days, the world was going to turn upside down in ways that would make our modern Christmas parties look like church services. What happens when you give a population that's been starving for 40 days unlimited access to food and alcohol, and then tell them that, for the next 12 days, the normal rules don't apply? You get something that would absolutely scandalize us today. You get medieval Christmas in full swing. And it was glorious chaos. The concept they called it was misrule. And I need you to really understand what that meant, because it's so alien to our modern experience that it's almost hard to believe it was real. From December 25th through January 6th, the 12 days of Christmas, society basically agreed to turn itself upside down, temporarily. The social hierarchy that governed every single aspect of medieval life, that determined who you could talk to and how, who you bowed to, who could give you orders, who you could marry, where you could live, what you could wear. All of that got suspended. Not completely, not everywhere. But enough that these 12 days felt like living in a different world. Servants could mock their masters. Children could command their parents. The lowest could for a brief shining moment become the highest. And everyone, from the king down to the poorest peasant, had to play along. It was the rule of misrule, the law of lawlessness, the one time each year when the oppressive weight of medieval social structure lifted just enough that people could breathe. Now, why would medieval society allow this? What purpose did it serve? That's the fascinating question. Some historians argue it was a safety valve. Medieval life was brutal, hierarchical, and unequal in ways we can barely imagine today. Peasants worked themselves to exhaustion for lords who could treat them as barely better than property. There was no social mobility, no hope of things getting better, no escape. That kind of pressure builds up. It creates resentment, anger, desperation. And if that pressure has no release, eventually it explodes into violence, into rebellion, into social collapse. But if you give people 12 days a year where they can let off steam, where they can play act at freedom, where they can mock the powerful and experience what it feels like to have authority, even if it's just pretend, well, that might be just enough to keep the lid on the pot, to make the other 353 days of the year bearable. Other historians point out that this tradition had deep pagan roots. Remember Saturnalia, the Roman festival where slaves temporarily became masters. This was that tradition, Christianized but essentially unchanged. And in pagan belief systems, these moments of cosmic reversal had religious significance. They represented the chaos that existed before creation, the necessary disorder that allows new order to emerge. By ritually enacting chaos, you prevented actual chaos. The Church had mixed feelings about all this, as you might imagine. On one hand, it clearly violated Christian principles of order and hierarchy. On the other hand, trying to suppress it might cause more problems than it solved. So Church authorities mostly tolerated misrule, tried to contain it within certain bounds, and probably drank quite a bit themselves to cope with it. So what did misrule actually look like in practice? Let me paint you some pictures, and I promise you, they're wilder than you're expecting. In many villages and towns, one of the first acts of Christmas Day, after the feasting, was the election of a Lord of Misrule, or Abbot of Unreason, or King of the Bean. The titles varied by region, but the concept was the same. Someone from the lower classes would be selected to be the mock ruler for the 12 days. Sometimes this was done by baking a cake, the bean cake or king cake, with a dried bean hidden inside. Whoever got the slice with the bean became the Lord of Misrule. Other times it was elected, or chosen by lot, or simply volunteered by whoever was drunkest and most willing to make a fool of themselves. And once chosen, this person had genuine authority, temporary, limited, but real. They could issue commands and people had to obey. They could demand that the actual lord of the manor serve them at table. They could order the priest to dance or sing silly songs. They could fine people for made-up infractions. They could stage mock trials and issue ridiculous sentences. There's a wonderful account from 15th century France. I know that's later than the Dark Ages proper, but the tradition extended back centuries, of a lord of misrule who ordered the actual lord to crawl around on all fours barking like a dog. And the lord did it. He had to. That was the rule. For 12 days the fool was king, and the king was a fool. Can you imagine the psychological release of that? If you were a serf who spent 353 days a year bowing and scraping and saying, "Yes, my lord, and of course, my lord," and then suddenly you could make that same lord bark like a dog, the catharsis must have been extraordinary. But it wasn't just about mock authority. The 12 days were filled with games, performances, and traditions that deliberately violated normal social norms. Cross-dressing was everywhere. Men dressed as women, women as men. This wasn't about gender identity in the modern sense. It was about chaos, about violating categories, about showing that the usual boundaries could be crossed. Young men would don women's clothing and go door to door singing in falsetto voices, demanding food and drink. Women might dress in men's clothing and mock fight with each other. In some regions, there was a tradition of men dressing as women to perform sacred offices in church. And before you think, surely the church didn't allow that. They absolutely did. There are records of bishops complaining about it, but also records showing it continued for centuries despite those complaints. The Feast of Fools, which we'll talk about more in a moment, regularly featured male clergy dressed in women's clothing performing parody masses. Animal masks were another huge tradition. People would wear masks depicting goats, bears, wolves, even mythical creatures. They'd parade through villages making animal noises, frightening children, acting wild and untamed. This had clear connections to the old pagan traditions, the wild hunt, the totemic animal spirits, but it had been absorbed into Christmas customs so thoroughly that most people probably didn't even think about the origins. These mass groups were called mummers in England, guisers in Scotland, and by various other names elsewhere. They'd go from house to house performing short plays or skits, usually bawdy, often involving death and resurrection themes, always loud and chaotic. And the homeowners were expected to provide food and drink, or face being pranked or cursed. The mumming plays had stock characters: St. George, the Turkish knight, the doctor, the fool. They'd fight, someone would die dramatically, the doctor would bring them back to life with ridiculous fake medicine, and everyone would celebrate. The plots made no sense. That wasn't the point. The point was the performance itself, the excuse to dress up and act crazy and demand hospitality from your neighbours. Gambling was another Christmas tradition that the church officially condemned but couldn't stop. Dice games, card games, betting on contests, all technically illegal the rest of the year, were openly practiced during Christmas, even inside churches apparently. There are multiple complaints from bishops about people gambling in the church itself during Christmas services, sometimes even at the altar. The logic, if there was any, seemed to be, if everything else is turned upside down, why not fortune itself? Why not literally roll the dice and see if luck favours you? Maybe the lowborn could win riches from the nobles. Maybe the cosmos itself would show favour to those who usually had none. Then there was the drinking. Oh, the drinking. We've mentioned this in passing, but I don't think we've really conveyed the scale of medieval Christmas alcohol consumption. It was staggering, prodigious, truly impressive in the worst possible way. Ale was the baseline beverage, not water. Water was often unsafe to drink in medieval times, so people drank ale all year round, including children. But Christmas ale was stronger, spiced, and consumed in quantities that would put modern fraternity parties to shame. Wine, for those who could afford it, flowed freely. Remember those 27 hogsheads at King John's feast? That wasn't an outlier. That was normal for royal Christmas celebrations, and much of that wine would be spiced and heated to make hippocras, a sweet, warm, highly alcoholic drink that medieval people believed had medicinal properties. Spoiler alert, the main medicinal property was that it got you extremely drunk. Mead, fermented honey, was another Christmas favourite, particularly in regions with strong Norse influence, and there was something called lamb's wool, which was hot ale mixed with roasted apples and spices, creating this frothy, warming concoction that tasted like liquid Christmas and had enough alcohol content to knock you flat. The goal, explicit in many sources, was to stay at least moderately drunk for all 12 days. Not falling down drunk necessarily, though that happened too, but maintaining a pleasant buzz that made everything seem funnier, warmer, more magical. It was escapism through chemistry, and it was completely socially acceptable, even expected. Medieval moralists wrote screeds against Christmas drunkenness. They called it sinful, disgraceful, animalistic. But nobody listened. Even many of the clergy who condemned drunkenness in their sermons were likely enjoying their own share of hippocras once the sermon was done. Dancing was everywhere. Not the formal, structured court dances that would develop later, but wild, energetic, sometimes almost violent folk dancing. In circles, in lines, in chaotic masses. Inside homes, in village squares, even in churches, though that last one got banned repeatedly, suggesting it kept happening anyway. The carol, which originally meant a circle dance with singing, was a Christmas staple. People would join hands in a ring and dance while singing, going faster and faster until people started stumbling and falling, which was apparently part of the fun. The songs could be religious, but they could also be bawdy, funny, satirical. Anything went. There's a fascinating detail from a 12th century account that mentions young people dancing in graveyards during Christmas. Dancing among the dead. This sounds macabre to us, but in medieval thinking, it made a kind of sense. The dead were part of the community. Christmas was about continuity, about connection across time. Dancing in the graveyard was a way of including the ancestors in the celebration, and then there were the games. So many games. Some were innocent enough, board games, dice, contests of strength or skill, but others were, let's say, problematic by modern standards. There was a game that involved tying a cat in a bag and hanging it from a tree, and then blindfolded people would swing sticks at it. I'm not going to describe more than that because it's genuinely upsetting, but it was a common Christmas entertainment. The medieval attitude toward animal suffering was very different from ours. Or there were games involving setting things on fire. Tar barrels would be lit and rolled down hills. Wheels would be wrapped in straw, set ablaze, and rolled through villages. This was partly spectacle, fire in the darkness, and partly vestigial sun worship rituals that nobody admitted were pagan anymore. Food fights happened. Snowball fights escalated into actual brawls. Pranks crossed the line into vandalism. The 12 days were supposed to be joyful, but joyful in medieval terms often meant rowdy to the point of dangerous. And through all of this, the drinking, the dancing, the games, the chaos, ran this thread of temporary freedom. These weren't riot days where law and order collapsed entirely. The violence, such as it was mostly contained. But it was also real permission to behave in ways that would get you punished, excommunicated, or even executed the rest of the year. A peasant could insult a noble, as long as it was during Christmas, as long as it was framed as part of the misrule. A woman could speak back to a man, a child could disobey a parent, and the victims of these minor rebellions had to take it with good humour, had to play along, because to refuse would mark you as a killjoy, as someone who didn't understand the spirit of Christmas. What's remarkable is how well this system usually worked. There are surprisingly few accounts of Christmas celebrations descending into actual violence or permanent social disruption. People seem to understand that this was a game, a ritual, a temporary suspension of reality. Come January 7th, everything would go back to normal. The servant would be a servant again. The Lord would be a Lord again. But for 12 days they could pretend otherwise. It was play. But it was the most serious kind of play, the kind that makes life bearable, that gives people hope, that prevents despair from calcifying into revolution. And nowhere was this combination of sacred and profane, order and chaos, piety and madness more visible than in the celebrations that took place in churches themselves. Because while all this wildness was happening in villages and great halls, something even stranger was happening in the supposedly holy spaces of Christianity. The clergy were about to have their own version of misrule, and it was going to be absolutely outrageous. Inside the stone walls of medieval churches, where you'd expect solemnity and reverence, something utterly bizarre was unfolding. The clergy, the very people who were supposed to be modelling Christian behaviour, were throwing the wildest parties of the entire Christmas season. And I'm not talking about a few priests having an extra cup of wine. I'm talking about organised, ritualised sacrilege that happened every single year, with the full knowledge of the church hierarchy. Welcome to the Feast of Fools. This celebration, also called the Feast of the Ass in some regions, took place on January 1st, right in the middle of the 12 days of Christmas, and it was essentially the clergy's version of misrule, but turned up to 11 and performed in the most sacred spaces imaginable. The basic concept was this. On one day each year, the lowest-ranking members of the clergy got to mock, parody, and humiliate their superiors. The subdeacons and minor clerics, the guys who normally swept floors, carried candles and kept their mouths shut, suddenly had complete authority, and they used it to create absolute pandemonium. Let me describe what this actually looked like, because the historical accounts are almost unbelievable. First, they'd elect a Bishop of Fools, or Pope of Fools, sometimes also called the Boy Bishop, though that's technically a slightly different tradition. This would be the youngest, lowest-ranking clerk they could find. Someone who, on any other day of the year, would never dare speak in the presence of actual bishops, and they'd dress him up in full episcopal regalia, the fancy robes, the tall hat, the staff, everything, and declare him the highest authority in the church for the day. Then the real chaos would begin. They'd process into the church, but not with dignified solemnity. Oh no, they'd be singing obscene parodies of sacred hymns, dancing. Some of them would be wearing the clothes of women, others would have their vestments on backwards. Some accounts mention clergy members riding donkeys directly into the church, right up to the altar. There's a particularly detailed complaint from the Bishop of Lincoln in England, written around 1236. He's absolutely scandalised by what he witnessed at the Feast of Fools. Let me paraphrase his description because it's absolutely wild. He says the junior clergy came into the church wearing monstrous masks and faces covered with paint. They brought with them puddings and sausages, which they proceeded to eat at the altar itself, the most sacred spot in the entire building. They played dice on the altar. They burned old shoes instead of incense, filling the church with acrid black smoke. They ran and jumped throughout the church in an unseemly manner, and, this is my favourite detail, they brayed like asses and made other animal noises during what was supposed to be a solemn mass. Another account, this one from Vivier in France, mentions clergy celebrating mass while wearing terrifying demon masks. The mass would be performed correctly, all the right words, all the right gestures, but the priest would be dressed as devils and monsters, turning the most sacred Christian ritual into something out of a nightmare. In some churches they'd perform a drunkard's mass, where every liturgical response would be replaced with drinking-related words. Instead of Dominus vobiscum, the Lord be with you, they'd say something like, bring us more wine. The congregation, also in on the joke, would respond with appropriate drinking-themed replies. At Sens Cathedral in France, there's a record of the Feast of Fools, including a staff of fools, essentially a mock papal staff topped with a carved fool's face instead of a cross. The Bishop of Fools would process through the church carrying this ridiculous staff, blessing people with it in obvious parody of real episcopal authority. Black pudding, blood sausage, seems to have played a huge role in these celebrations. Multiple sources mention clergy eating black pudding at the altar, which was both a violation of where you should eat, not at the altar, and what you should eat during certain church festivals. It was deliberately transgressive on multiple levels. Now here's what makes this even more remarkable. Senior clergy knew this was happening. Bishops received reports. Archbishops issued condemnations. And yet the Feast of Fools continued for centuries. Why? Partly because trying to stop it might have caused a genuine revolt among junior clergy. These men had incredibly hard lives. They'd spent years, sometimes decades, in training. They'd taken vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. They lived under strict discipline. They had almost no authority or autonomy, and once a year they got to blow off steam in the most spectacular way imaginable. If you took that away from them, you risk them leaving the church entirely, or causing disruptions that would last far longer than one day of controlled chaos. But there's also a deeper theological justification that some church leaders used. They pointed to passages in the Bible about the last being first, about God lifting up the lowly and bringing down the mighty. The Magnificat, Mary's song in the Gospel of Luke, explicitly says that God has brought down rulers from their thrones but has lifted up the humble. So you could argue, and some did, that the Feast of Fools was actually living out this biblical principle. For one day, the humble were lifted up. The powerful were brought low. It was God's kingdom made manifest, albeit in a very strange and bawdy way. The boy bishop tradition was related but slightly different. This usually happened on December 28th, the Feast of the Holy Innocents, the day commemorating the children Herod killed while trying to murder the infant Jesus. On this day, a young boy would be chosen, sometimes from the choir, sometimes from a local school, and made bishop for the day. The boy bishop would dress in miniature episcopal vestments, carefully tailored to fit a child. He'd carry a tiny staff, and he'd perform actual religious functions. He'd give sermons, he'd lead processions, he'd even grant blessings that were considered genuinely valid by the church. There are account books from various English churches showing payments made to boy bishops. Edward thus of England had a boy bishop say vespers before him in 1299. His son, Edward II, gave a boy bishop 10 shillings in 1316, a substantial sum. This wasn't fringe weirdness. This was mainstream medieval Christmas tradition at the highest levels. The boy bishop's sermon was often the highlight. A child, usually around 10 or 12 years old, would stand in the pulpit and preach to a congregation of adults. Sometimes these sermons were genuinely pious. Other times they were cheeky, using childish logic to point out hypocrisies in adult behaviour. The congregation was expected to listen respectfully, and reportedly they did. After the sermon, the boy bishop would lead a procession through the town and people would give him gifts of food and money. This wasn't charity, it was obligation. To refuse the boy bishop would be to refuse the Christ child himself, or so the logic went. But the most outrageous Christmas church tradition, the one that absolutely scandalized church authorities and yet persisted for centuries, was the Feast of the Ass. This celebration, which happened in parts of France, commemorated the flight of Mary, Joseph and Jesus into Egypt to escape Herod's massacre. But the way they commemorated it was, well, let me just describe it. They'd bring an actual donkey into the church, not a representation of a donkey, an actual living, breathing donkey. They'd dress it up in fancy cloth, sometimes even in mock clerical vestments, and they'd parade it up to the altar while singing a special song called the Song of the Ass. The lyrics, and these actually survive, are half Latin, half French, and include this refrain: hee-haw, hee-haw, hee-haw. Yes, really. A church song with hee-haw as the chorus. The song praises the donkey. From the east the ass has come, beautiful and very brave, well fitted to bear burdens. Up, Sir Ass, and sing. Open your mouth bravely. Hee-haw. And here's the part that really got church authorities upset. At certain points in the Mass, instead of the congregation responding Amen, they were supposed to bray like donkeys. The priest would say something in Latin, and the entire congregation would respond with hee-haw, hee-haw. Can you even imagine? The most sacred ritual of Christianity transformed into a barnyard comedy. The donkey would stand at the altar throughout the Mass. It would be fed and watered right there in the church, and at the end it would be solemnly blessed and led back out in procession, still wearing its fancy vestments. Church officials hated this. They issued condemnation after condemnation. The Council of Basel in 1435 explicitly banned the Feast of the Ass. The Council of Toledo had banned it even earlier, but it kept happening. Because people loved it, clergy loved it, and in a strange way, it felt true to something deep in Christianity. This religion that said God became a helpless infant, that celebrated the humble and rejected the proud, that found divinity in the most unexpected places. If God could become a baby born in a stable surrounded by animals, why couldn't a donkey be honoured in church? That was the logic anyway. These church celebrations weren't separate from the secular misrule happening outside. They were part of the same phenomenon, a society-wide agreement that for 12 days the normal order of things could be suspended, questioned, mocked, and inverted. And it served a purpose. Psychologically, socially, even spiritually. It was a pressure valve, yes. But it was also a reminder that human hierarchies weren't eternal, weren't divinely ordained, weren't as solid and permanent as they seemed. Even the church, with all its power, all its authority, all its claims to represent God on earth, could be mocked. Even sacred rituals could be parodied. For one day, the pompous bishop had to watch a 10-year-old boy do his job. The serious priest had to bray like a donkey. The magnificent cathedral had to host a barnyard animal at its altar, and everyone survived. The cosmos didn't collapse. God didn't strike anyone dead. And maybe, just maybe, that taught people something important. That power was temporary. That authority was conditional, that the mighty could be brought low and the low lifted up. that nothing in this world was quite as fixed and unchangeable as it appeared. But these church celebrations, wild as they were actually the calm before the storm. Because as we moved deeper into the 12 days, as we approached 12th night on January 5th, the chaos was going to escalate even further. The Lord of Misrule would reach the peak of his power. The drinking would intensify. The social inversions would become more extreme. And on that final night, medieval Christmas would reach its absolute, glorious, magnificent climax of controlled madness. Everything we've talked about so far, the feasting, the drinking, the misrule, the sacred parodies, all of it was building toward one ultimate celebration, one final explosion of joy and chaos before the world had to return to normal. And when that night came, medieval people pulled out all the stops. Picture yourself walking through a medieval village on a cold January evening, perhaps around the year 850 AD. You're bundled against the cold, your breath forming clouds in the air, and suddenly, from around a corner, you hear them coming. Shouts, laughter, the clash of sticks against makeshift drums. You freeze, because what's approaching isn't quite human anymore. It's something between human and beast, between order and chaos, between this world and whatever lies beyond. The mummers have arrived. We touched on mumming briefly before, but I haven't really conveyed what an utterly strange, sometimes terrifying, always unforgettable experience it was to encounter these masked figures during the 12 days of Christmas. This wasn't gentle carolers politely singing on your doorstep. This was something far older, far wilder, and far more unsettling. The tradition of mumming, from the Middle English word mum, meaning silent or masked, had roots that reached back into pagan antiquity. These were rituals of transformation, where ordinary people became something other, where the boundary between human and animal dissolved, where the dead could walk among the living. Mummers would spend days preparing their costumes and masks, and these weren't cute Halloween masks. These were deliberately disturbing, carved from wood, shaped from straw, fashioned from animal skins and skulls. Common designs included goats with massive twisted horns, bears with teeth bared, horses with wild eyes, and stranger things, hybrid creatures that existed nowhere in nature. The goat was particularly significant. The straw goat, or Yule goat, was a Scandinavian tradition that spread throughout Northern Europe. Young men would construct elaborate goat costumes, sometimes just masks and horns, sometimes full-body affairs that required 2 people to operate, like a pantomime horse, but infinitely more menacing. These goat figures had deep connections to Thor, whose chariot was pulled by goats, and possibly even older fertility rituals. Wearing these masks, carrying torches or lanterns, the mummers would travel in groups from house to house. But they didn't politely knock and wait. They'd burst in, making noise, performing, demanding hospitality, and homeowners had to provide it. Food, drink, maybe coins, or face consequences. What consequences? Well, that's where things get interesting. If you refuse the mummers, they might perform a curse. Not a real curse necessarily, but a theatrical one that could be genuinely frightening. They'd point at your house and declare that your crops would fail next year, your animals would sicken, your children would fall ill. And in a pre-scientific world where people genuinely believed in the power of curses, this could cause real psychological distress. Or they'd play pranks, harmless ones like moving your gate, stacking firewood in front of your door. Less harmless ones like letting your animals loose, stealing food from your storage, or, and this is documented, defecating on your doorstep as a gesture of extreme disrespect. The threat was mostly performative, a game everyone understood. but it had teeth. It worked because people genuinely didn't want to be known as stingy or inhospitable. That reputation could follow you. And during the misrule of Christmas, when normal social protection didn't fully apply, being targeted by mummers could make you a laughingstock. The performances themselves were bizarre. The most common was the hero combat play, which had dozens of regional variations but always the same basic structure. A hero, usually St. George or King Arthur, would fight a villain, the Turkish knight, the Black Knight, the dragon. They'd battle with wooden swords, lots of theatrical death throes, copious fake blood. The hero would die dramatically. Then a doctor character would appear, claiming to have travelled from distant lands and learned miraculous cures. He'd perform ridiculous medical procedures, pouring water on the corpse, hitting it with a stick, shouting Latin-sounding gibberish, and miraculously the hero would rise from the dead. Death and resurrection. The core mystery of Christianity, but also the core mystery of winter itself. The sun dies and is reborn, the crops die and return, life emerges from death. The mummers were enacting this ancient truth through folk theatre that was half sacred, half absurd. But between the death and resurrection, something else would happen. The plays would be interrupted by a character called the Fool, or the Clown, who'd interact with the audience, make jokes, break the fourth wall. The humour was often crude: bathroom jokes, sexual innuendo, mockery of authority figures. This was peasant comedy, earthy and unrefined. And then there were the more unsettling mumming traditions, the ones that seemed to come from somewhere darker and older. In some regions, mummers would go out on the longest nights, especially Christmas Eve and New Year's Eve, specifically to frighten people. They'd wear their most terrifying masks, carry no lights, and lurk in shadows. When someone passed, they'd leap out with inhuman shrieks, chasing them down the street. The victim would run, genuinely terrified, while the mummers laughed and howled behind their masks. This was called going a-souling in some areas, or running the hare in others. And before you think that sounds like assault, remember, this was expected behaviour during Christmas. It was part of the season. Young people were supposed to be wild, to test boundaries, to be slightly dangerous. It was a rite of passage, a release of adolescent energy that had been constrained all year. There are accounts, and these are genuinely dark, of people dying of fright during mumming encounters. Elderly people with weak hearts, encountering masked figures in the night, would collapse. The mummers would remove their masks, reveal themselves as local boys, and face serious consequences. But it kept happening, which tells you how deeply embedded this tradition was. The masks themselves had power beyond just disguise. In medieval thinking, when you put on a mask representing an animal or spirit, you didn't just pretend to be that thing. You became it partially. The mask was a portal. It allowed something else, the spirit of the goat, the ghost of winter, the essence of chaos, to inhabit your body temporarily. This is why church authorities were so uncomfortable with mumming, even though they tolerated it. It was too pagan, too shamanistic, too close to actual magic. When you put on that goat mask and danced wildly through the village, were you still Christian? Or had you temporarily reverted to something older? Different regions had different mumming traditions, and they're all equally fascinating. In Wales, there was the Marilweed, the grey mare. Groups would carry a horse skull on a pole, decorated with ribbons and bells, with a sheet draped below to hide the person carrying it. The horse's jaw would be rigged to snap open and closed, and this terrifying puppet would go from door to door, singing challenges in Welsh verse. The homeowner would have to respond with their own verse, engaging in a battle of wit and poetry with this undead horsehead. If the homeowner ran out of verses, they'd have to let the Murrylwyd into their house, where it would snap its jaws at people, chase them around, and generally cause havoc until given food and drink. It's such a specific, bizarre tradition. Why a horse skull? Why poetry battles? Nobody knows for certain, but it might connect to ancient Celtic horse worship, or to the mythological Rhiannon who rode a magical horse, or to death itself, the pale horse of the apocalypse. Whatever the origin, it was weird and wonderful and absolutely would have given me nightmares as a child. In Scotland and northern England there was first footing, a New Year's tradition that's actually still practiced in modified form today. The first person to cross your threshold after midnight on New Year's Eve would determine your luck for the coming year. Ideally, this should be a tall, dark-haired man carrying gifts of coal, bread and whiskey, symbols of warmth, food and good cheer. But if the first footer was wrong, if they were a woman or blonde or arrived empty-handed, it could bring terrible luck. So people took this seriously. They'd arrange for the right person to be their first footer, and in some villages, groups of young men would dress up and race from house to house, competing to be the first footer and claim the reward of food and drink. This could get violent. There are records of actual fights breaking out between rival first-footing groups, broken bones, bloodshed, all because of a folk tradition about who steps through your door first. It shows how seriously people took these seasonal rituals. The tradition of souling was related but different. Groups, often children, sometimes adults, would go door to door singing soul songs and requesting soul cakes, small round cakes marked with a cross. For each cake received, they'd promise to pray for the dead souls of the household's ancestors. This connected to the medieval Catholic belief in purgatory, that dead souls who weren't quite holy enough for heaven, but not wicked enough for hell, would spend time in a painful middle state, being purified. Prayers from the living could supposedly speed up this process, reducing the dead's suffering. So when soulers came to your door, they were offering a transaction. Give us food, and we'll help your dead relatives get to heaven faster. It was charity, but with a supernatural incentive, and it worked. People gave generously, not wanting their ancestors to suffer any longer than necessary. Now all of this, the mumming, the masks, the performances, the first footing, the souling, it all created this atmosphere throughout the 12 days where normal reality felt suspended. You never knew when masked figures might appear at your door. You never knew if that knock in the night was carolers or something more unsettling. The boundary between entertainment and threat, between fun and fear, was deliberately blurred, and I think that was the point. Medieval life was hard, controlled, predictable in its hardships. You knew what each day would bring: work, authority, obligation, hunger, cold, repetition. The 12 days of Christmas created a space where you didn't know what would happen, where surprise was possible, where anything might walk through your door. That unpredictability was frightening, yes, but it was also exhilarating. It made you feel alive in a way that ordinary life didn't. For 12 days you lived in a world where magic, or something like magic, was real and present and might manifest at any moment. The masks, the performances, the traditions, they weren't just entertainment. They were portals, ways of accessing something deeper, older, stranger, ways of touching the sacred and the profane simultaneously, ways of being fully human by temporarily becoming something other than human. And as the 12 days progressed, as we move closer to that final culmination on 12th night, all these threads, the feasting, the drinking, the misrule, the church chaos, the masked performers, they're all going to come together in one ultimate celebration. The king of the bean will reach his peak of power. The normal world will be at its furthest remove, and medieval people will throw everything they have into one last glorious night of controlled chaos before reality reasserts itself. But before we get to that grand finale, we need to talk about something that gave all of this its deeper meaning. Because behind all the wildness and drunkenness and bizarre folk customs, there was something else happening during medieval Christmas. Something musical, something beautiful, something that connected heaven and earth through the simple act of human voices raised in song. Amid all the chaos and masks and drunken revelry, there was a sound weaving through medieval Christmas that transformed everything it touched. A sound so powerful it could make grown men weep, so ancient it seemed to come from the earth itself, so transcendent it felt like heaven leaning down to kiss the frozen ground. The sound of human voices singing together in the darkness. Music during the Dark Ages Christmas wasn't background noise. It wasn't entertainment playing softly while you did other things. It was the very fabric of the celebration, the thread connecting the sacred and profane, the bridge between this world and whatever lay beyond. And the way medieval people used music, the purposes it served, the emotions it unleashed, that's something we've lost and we're poorer for it. Let me take you inside a medieval church during Christmas, because this is where the musical tradition really came alive. The building would be cold, stone holds onto winter like a grudge. Your breath would be visible. But hundreds of bodies packed together create warmth, and hundreds of candles create light, and when the singing begins, something shifts in the air itself. The earliest Christmas carols weren't the gentle, harmonious songs we know today. They were Gregorian chants, monophonic melodies sung in Latin by voices trained from childhood to produce this particular, otherworldly sound. If you've never heard authentic Gregorian chant, it's almost impossible to describe. It's not quite natural. The voices blend until you can't distinguish individual singers. The melody seems to float, weightless, without a clear rhythm or beat. It exists in some space between human and divine. One of the most ancient Christmas chants that survives is Puer natus est nobis, a boy is born to us. It dates back to at least the 6th century, possibly earlier. The melody moves in waves, rising and falling like breath itself, and when it was sung in a stone church with good acoustics, the sound would reverberate layer upon layer, creating harmonics that weren't being sung but emerged from the space itself. Medieval people believed these resonances were angels joining the human voices, not metaphorically, actually. They thought that when humans sang correctly with pure intention, angels would be drawn to participate. The overlap of heavenly and earthly music, that's what they were hearing in those harmonics. Another ancient one is Veni, Veni, Emmanuel, O come, Emmanuel. We still sing this today, though usually in a very different style. The medieval version was haunting, almost mournful. It's technically an Advent song sung during those 40 days of fasting, and it carries all that longing, all that hunger, all that desperate hope for deliverance. The Latin text includes lines like Veni, Veni, Domine, et noli tardare. Come, come, Lord, and do not delay. You can hear the desperation. Medieval people weren't singing about abstract theological concepts. They were crying out from real darkness, real cold, real suffering, and Christmas was the answer to that cry. But here's where it gets really interesting. These sacred Latin chants existed alongside a completely different musical tradition. The folk songs, the vernacular carols, the stuff regular people sang when they weren't in church. The word carol originally meant a circle dance. It comes from the Old French carol, which meant a ring dance with singing. So when medieval people went carolling, they weren't just singing, they were dancing in circles, often outdoors in the freezing cold because remember, the church had banned dancing in churches. These folk carols were in whatever local language people actually spoke, English, French, German, Norse dialects, not Latin. And they were lively, rhythmic, made for movement. You could dance to them. You could clap. You could stomp. They had verses and choruses that everybody knew, so anyone could join in. One of the oldest surviving English carols is the Boar's Head Carol, which we mentioned before but haven't really explored. The lyrics are fascinating. The boar's head in hand bear I, bedecked with bays and rosemary. And I pray you, my masters, be merry, quot estis in convivio. That last part, quot estis in convivio, means as many as are at the feast. It's mixing English and Latin, sacred and secular, pagan symbolism and Christian celebration. The melody is stately, almost march-like. You can imagine it being sung as the massive boar's head is carried into the great hall, everyone turning to watch, their voices rising together. It's not gentle, it's not peaceful, it's triumphant, boastful even. Look what we've conquered, look what we're about to eat, join us in celebration. Then there's In Dulci Jubilo, in sweet rejoicing. This is a macaronic carol meaning it mixes languages, in this case Latin and German. The story goes that a 14th century German mystic named Heinrich Soese had a vision of angels singing this song and dancing in a circle, and he wrote down what he heard. The lyrics bounce between languages within the same sentence. In dulci jubilo, nun singet und seid froh. In sweet rejoicing, now sing and be glad. It creates this wonderful effect where neither language dominates. It's universal, transcendent, belonging to no single culture but to everyone. And the melody. Oh, the melody is joyful in a way that's almost aggressive. It demands that you be happy. It insists on joy. There's something deeply medieval about that. Not the gentle, wistful joy of modern Christmas songs, but a fierce, defiant joy. Yes, it's dark. Yes, it's cold. Yes, life is hard. But right now, in this moment, we choose joy anyway. There's another carol called Gaudet, Latin for rejoice. It's from the 16th century, slightly later than our period, but it represents a tradition that went back much further. The chorus is simple and repetitive. Gaudet, gaudet. Christus est natus ex Maria Virgin, gaudet. Rejoice, rejoice. Christ is born of the Virgin Mary, rejoice. But what makes it extraordinary is the melody. It's in a minor key, which gives it this bittersweet quality. It's joyful, but with an edge of melancholy. Joy that knows suffering. Hope that's acquainted with despair. Very medieval, very real. These carols weren't performed by professional musicians. They were sung by everyone, noble and peasant, clergy and layperson, young and old. Music was one of the few truly democratic aspects of medieval life. You didn't need to be able to read. You didn't need training. You just needed a voice and the willingness to join in. And the social function of this communal singing was enormous. Think about it. For most of the year, medieval society was rigidly hierarchical. The lord spoke to the knight, who spoke to the freeman, who spoke to the serf. Strict boundaries, formal language, social distance. But when everyone was singing the same carol, those boundaries dissolved. The same melody came from the lord's mouth and the serf's mouth, the same words, the same rhythm. For those few minutes they were equal, united, part of something larger than their individual identities. There's a profound psychological power in group singing that we modern people have largely forgotten. When you sing with others, Your breathing synchronizes. Your heartbeats begin to align. Studies have shown this. It's not metaphor, it's physiology. You literally become connected at a biological level. Medieval people didn't know the science, but they felt it. They knew that singing together created unity, dissolved barriers, made people feel part of a community in ways that nothing else could. And during Christmas, this communal singing happened constantly. In churches during services, in great halls during feasts in village squares, groups going door to door, spontaneous gatherings around fires. The entire 12 days were soaked in music. But not all Christmas singing was joyful or sacred. There was also a tradition of satirical songs, mocking songs, songs that pushed boundaries and challenged authority. Remember the Feast of Fools? The music during these celebrations was deliberately profane. Sacred melodies with obscene lyrics, or drinking songs set to the tunes of hymns. This was parody as spiritual practice, if that makes sense. By inverting the sacred, by making it ridiculous, they were exploring its limits, testing its boundaries. There's a genre called Goliardic songs, named after wandering scholars called Goliads, who travelled from town to town singing satirical, often blasphemous verses. These weren't specifically Christmas songs, but during the 12 days when normal rules were suspended, Goliardic songs would come out of hiding. They'd mock corrupt clergy, satirize greedy merchants, make fun of stupid nobles, put sexual lyrics to church melodies. It was dangerous humour, the kind that could get you in serious trouble any other time of year. But during Christmas, under the protection of misrule, these songs circulated freely. One collection called the Carmina Burana, yes, the same one that inspired that famous classical piece, contains hundreds of these medieval satirical songs. Many reference Christmas celebrations, feasting, drinking, and activities that definitely weren't church-approved. They're clever, bawdy, and often genuinely funny. Instruments accompanied much of this music, though not in church. Instruments were banned from sacred services until much later. But in secular settings, you'd hear lyres, harps, fiddles, early violins, flutes, bagpipes. Yes, really. And drums. The bagpipe, incidentally, was incredibly popular in medieval times across all of Europe, not just Scotland. It was loud enough to be heard outdoors, portable, and could play continuously, perfect for dancing. Many Christmas celebrations featured bagpipe music, often played by travelling musicians who'd go from village to village during the season, performing for food and shelter. There's something deeply moving about imagining these medieval musicians, often poor, sometimes disabled or disfigured, which prevented them from other work. They'd travel in the coldest, darkest part of the year, bringing music to isolated communities. They were valued, welcomed, fed. Their skill gave them a kind of status that overrode their low birth. Music was power. Music was magic. Music could transform a moment, heal a wound, create connection where none existed, and medieval people knew this in their bones. But there's one more aspect of medieval Christmas music we need to talk about, and it's possibly the most important: lullabies. Songs sung to the Christ child, imagining Mary in that stable, rocking her baby, singing to him in the cold night. These lullabies are heartbreaking in their tenderness. They address Jesus directly, intimately. Luli Lula, thou little tiny child. That's from the Coventry Carol, probably late medieval. The melody is simple, gentle, meant to be sung quietly, one person to one baby. But here's what gets me. These lullabies weren't just about Jesus, they were about every baby. Every mother in the congregation or the village singing that lullaby was also singing to her own child, remembering her own nights of keeping a baby warm in the winter, fearing for its survival. Infant mortality in medieval times was catastrophic. 30 to 50% of children died before age 5. Every mother knew the terror of watching a sick child, knowing she might lose them. These Christmas lullabies channeled that fear, that love, that desperate hope that this fragile life would survive. So when they sang to baby Jesus, they were also singing to their own babies, living and dead. They were connecting their personal grief and joy to the cosmic story, making their small lives part of something infinite. That's the deepest magic of medieval Christmas music. It took the sacred and made it personal. It took the personal and made it sacred. It dissolved the boundary between heaven and earth, between then and now, between individual and community. And as the 12 days progressed toward their climax, as the drinking intensified and the misrule reached its peak, the music would be there, threading through everything. Rowdy drinking songs and solemn chants, bawdy satires and tender lullabies, the high and the low, the sacred and profane, all mixed together in one glorious, chaotic, utterly human symphony. But we're approaching the final night now, 12th night, the culmination of everything, the moment when all the threads we've been following, the feasting, the drinking, the social inversion, the masks, the music, all come together in one ultimate celebration before the world returns to normal. And medieval people had a very specific ritual for that night, one involving cake and beans and temporary kingship and chaos pushed to its absolute limit. January 5th, 12th night, the final evening of Christmas. After 11 days of continuous celebration, after all the feasting and drinking and masked chaos, medieval people gathered for one last explosive burst of revelry before the world had to return to its normal, hierarchical, orderly self. And the centerpiece of this ultimate celebration was something that sounds almost innocent, a cake. But this wasn't just any cake. This was the king cake, the bean cake, the lottery that could transform a peasant into a king and turn an entire evening into controlled anarchy. Let me explain how this worked, because it's both simple and completely wild. Sometime on 12th night, usually in the evening after the day's work was done, though for the wealthy who'd been celebrating continuously, the timing was more fluid. The household would gather. Lord and lady, servants and workers, family members and guests, everyone who was present for the celebration, and someone, usually the lady of the house or the head cook, would bring out the special cake. It was a rich fruit cake, dense with whatever dried fruits and nuts the household could afford, honey for sweetness, spices if they had them, substantial enough that even small slices would be filling. But the cake itself wasn't the point. The point was what was hidden inside it. A single dried bean. Just one. Baked into the cake before cooking, hidden somewhere in the dense interior where no one could see it or predict where it would be. And whoever got the slice with the bean in it would become the king or queen of the bean, the lord of misrule for the night. Now, we've talked about lords of misrule before, but the 12th night version was special. This wasn't just any night of the 12 days, this was the last night. The final opportunity for chaos before Epiphany tomorrow would mark the return to ordinary time, ordinary rules, ordinary life. So the king of the bean had more power, more license, more authority to push things further than they'd been pushed before. The ceremony of cutting the cake was serious business. Everyone would watch intently as the slices were distributed. Who would get the bean? The anticipation was delicious. Would it be the Lord himself? Imagine the irony, the king becoming king. Would it be a servant girl who'd suddenly have power over her masters? Would it be a child who'd order adults around? A priest who could parody his own authority? The moment someone bit into their slice and discovered the bean, everything changed. They'd hold it up, this tiny, ordinary dried bean, and the room would erupt. Cheering, shouting, maybe some good-natured groaning from those who'd hoped to get it themselves. And the bean holder would be crowned, literally, with a makeshift crown. Sometimes it was made of paper, sometimes twisted straw, sometimes actual gold or silver if the household was wealthy and wanted to honour the tradition fully. And from that moment until dawn, they ruled. Absolutely. The historical accounts of what kings and queens of the bean actually did with their power are fascinating and sometimes shocking. Remember, this was all sanctioned, expected, part of the tradition. But the specifics could get wild. There's an account from a French monastery, yes, even monasteries participated in this, where a young novice monk got the bean. This kid, who normally had to keep silent, obey instantly, spend hours in prayer and study, suddenly had absolute authority over the abbot, the prior, all the senior monks, and he used it. He ordered the abbot to perform all the novices' usual chores, sweeping floors, hauling water, serving at table. He made the stern prior sing silly songs. He issued ridiculous pronouncements that everyone had to pretend to take seriously. He held a mock trial where senior monks were accused of absurd crimes. Brother Thomas, you're charged with having too serious a face, and issued silly punishments. The account describes this young monk getting more and more bold as the night went on, as he realised that yes, they really were going to let him do this, yes, this was actually allowed. And by the end of the night, he'd essentially turned the monastery's entire hierarchy upside down. At noble houses, the stakes were even higher. There's a wonderful story from the court of King James I of Scotland in the 15th century. I know this is later than the Dark Ages proper, but it illustrates a tradition that extended back centuries. A common soldier got the bean at a royal Twelfth Night feast, and he ordered the king, the actual king, to get down on his knees and sing a love song to the Queen. King James did it. He had to. That was the rule. And according to the account, he did it with good humour, because refusing would have marked him as a bad sport, someone who didn't respect the traditions, someone who took himself too seriously. Even absolute monarchs had to submit to the king of the bean. The power wasn't just ceremonial. The king of the bean could issue actual commands that had to be obeyed. They could demand food, drink, entertainment. They could order people to swap clothes. They could make the strict dance with the wild, the pious behave foolishly, the foolish act wise. There was usually a limit, unspoken but understood. You couldn't order anything truly dangerous or genuinely cruel. You couldn't make someone do something that would cause lasting harm or shame. This was play, after all, sanctioned inversion. But within those bounds, almost anything went. And the drinking on Twelfth Night, oh, the drinking reached levels that would be concerning even by medieval standards, which, as we've established, were already pretty extreme. This was the last night to get drunk without consequences. Starting the next day, Epiphany, the church would expect people to return to normal piety. The fast of Advent was long past, but ordinary life with its ordinary restrictions was about to resume. So people drank like they were trying to store up alcohol for the coming year. Toasts to the King of the Bean, toast to everyone who'd hosted them, toast to saints and angels, toast to the dead, toast to abstract concepts like friendship and joy and the old year. Any excuse to drink. The wassail bowl made its rounds continuously. Remember, we're sailing from Christmas Eve. By Twelfth Night, the wassail had evolved. It wasn't just warm spiced cider or ale anymore. Households would add everything they had left: wine, spirits, fruit juices, honey, more spices. The result was this incredibly potent mixture that was different every year, every household. But it was always strong, always sweet, always warming, and always free-flowing. There's a medieval drinking song specifically for Twelfth Night that includes the line, "Drink up, drink deep, for tomorrow we weep." Not literally weep necessarily, but return to ordinary life with its ordinary sorrows. The implication is clear. This is your last chance. Make it count. Games on Twelfth Night were more intense versions of what had been happening throughout the 12 days. Dice games with higher stakes, contests of strength that got more competitive, more physical, pranks that pushed boundaries further than they had before. One popular Twelfth Night game was called Hot Cockles. One person would kneel or bend over covering their eyes, while others took turns slapping them on the backside. The person being slapped had to guess who'd hit them. If they guessed correctly, that person took their place. If they guessed wrong, they got hit again. It sounds childish, maybe even a bit problematic. But in the context of medieval social hierarchy, it's actually remarkable. A servant could slap a lord, a woman could hit a man, a child could whack an adult. All sanctioned, all part of the game, all acceptable because it was Twelfth Night. Another game involved apples hanging from strings. You'd try to bite them without using your hands, basically bobbing for apples but in midair instead of in water. Seems innocent enough, except people were drunk. The apples were often coated with honey or syrup, and the whole thing devolved into chaos pretty quickly. People falling over, sticky faces, lots of laughter and mockery. Forfeits were a huge part of Twelfth Night entertainment. The King of the Bean would issue forfeits, challenges or tasks that people had to complete. These could be simple: sing a song, tell a joke, dance a jig. But they could also be elaborate and embarrassing. Declare your love to that chair as if it were your sweetheart. Perform an entire church service to this broom. Speak only in rhymes for the next hour. People who refused forfeits faced consequences, usually having to drink a massive cup of wassail in one go, which sounds fun but was actually quite difficult and potentially nauseating given how much everyone had already been drinking. The entertainment could also include more organised performances. Professional entertainers, minstrels, acrobats, jugglers would travel specifically to be at wealthy houses on Twelfth Night. They'd perform their best material, knowing this was the most appreciative audience they'd have all year. People who were drunk, happy, generous with tips, willing to laugh at anything. Some households would stage elaborate masks or tableaux, essentially frozen scenes or short plays depicting biblical stories, classical myths, or allegorical concepts. These could be serious and beautiful, with expensive costumes and genuine artistic merit. Or they could be intentionally absurd parodies. The wealthy could afford both, often in the same evening. Music, of course, was constant. We talked about Christmas music generally, but Twelfth Night had its own specific songs. Many were about saying goodbye to Christmas, acknowledging that this was the end. There's a real melancholy underlying the revelry, joy mixed with sadness, the knowledge that this special time is ending. One tradition that's particularly poignant. In some regions, people would undress the greenery on Twelfth Night. All the holly, ivy and mistletoe that had been decorating homes and churches for 12 days would be taken down. But not thrown away. That would be bad luck. Instead, it would be ceremonially burned, often in the dying Yule log if it was still smouldering, or in a special fire built for the purpose. As the greenery burned, people would sing specific songs about the end of winter, the coming of spring, the cycle of death and rebirth. The smoke rising into the dark January sky was meant to carry their prayers and wishes for the coming year It was beautiful, sad, hopeful, very medieval in its mixing of pagan symbolism and Christian prayer. And then there was the tradition of blessing the crops, even though the crops were, of course, buried under snow or frozen ground. Groups would go out to the fields, yes, at night, in January, probably quite drunk, and sing to the earth, pour wassail on the ground, maybe plant a piece of the 12th night cake in the soil as an offering. This was pure pagan agricultural magic, barely disguised as Christian ritual. They were trying to ensure next year's harvest through sympathetic magic, feeding the earth now so it would feed them later. The church knew this was happening and mostly looked the other way. By this point in Christmas, they'd given up trying to control everything. As midnight approached, the actual moment when 12th night would end and Epiphany would begin, things would reach a crescendo. The king of the bean would make their final pronouncements. The last of the special Christmas food would be consumed. The last of the wassail would be drunk. The last songs would be sung. And then, right at midnight, it would stop, not gradually, suddenly, as if someone had flipped a switch. The king of the bean would remove their crown. The Lord would be a Lord again. The servant would be a servant again. The masks would come off. The inversion would end. Epiphany had arrived. The 3 wise men had reached the Christ child. The Christmas season was officially over, and tomorrow everyone would wake up hungover, exhausted, probably regretting at least a few of their choices, and return to the ordinary world. But here's the thing about that return, about that transition from the chaos of Christmas back to the order of ordinary life. It wasn't just flipping a switch. It couldn't be. 12 days of living differently, of experiencing freedom and equality and joy, of seeing your superiors humiliated and yourself elevated. That changes you. It had to. And perhaps that was the deepest purpose of medieval Christmas. Not just the safety valve we talked about before, though it was that, but also an annual reminder that the social order wasn't natural, wasn't inevitable, wasn't ordained by God in quite the fixed way that authorities claimed. Because if it could be inverted for 12 days, if servants could command lords and lords could obey, if the whole structure could be turned upside down and everyone survived it, well, then maybe that structure was more fragile than it appeared. Maybe Christmas was quietly revolutionary, teaching people that a different world was possible, even if only temporarily, giving them a taste of freedom that they'd remember during the long months of submission that followed. Throughout everything we've discussed, the feasting, the chaos, the music, the social inversion, there's been another dimension we've only touched on briefly, a darker thread running beneath all the celebration. Because medieval people didn't just believe Christmas was a time for joy and revelry. They believed it was a time when the supernatural world pressed closest to our own, when spirits walked freely, when the dead could return, and when forces beyond human comprehension were abroad in the winter darkness. We talked about the wild hunt on Christmas Eve, but that was just the beginning. The entire 12 days were considered a liminal period, a time when normal rules of reality didn't quite apply, and medieval people took this very, very seriously. Let me tell you about the Christmas omens, because this is something that consumed medieval people, with a mixture of fascination and dread. The Church taught that God sent signs, particularly during sacred seasons, to those who knew how to read them. And Christmas, being the most sacred season, was absolutely thick with prophetic significance. There were texts called prognostics that circulated throughout medieval Europe. These were essentially guides to interpreting signs during the 12 days. They'd tell you what different weather patterns meant, what animal behavior indicated, what dreams signified. And people studied these texts intensely, because getting the interpretation wrong could mean disaster for the coming year. Here's how it worked. Each of the 12 days corresponded to 1 month of the coming year. Christmas Day represented January, December 26th represented February, December 27th was March, and so on through Epiphany representing December. Whatever happened on each day, particularly the weather, was believed to predict what that corresponding month would be like. So if Christmas Day was bright and sunny, January would be mild and pleasant. If December 28th brought heavy snow, March would be harsh and difficult. This wasn't just folklore. People made serious agricultural and economic decisions based on these predictions: when to plant certain crops, whether to slaughter extra livestock, how much grain to store. Anne Lawrence Mathers, the medieval historian at the University of Reading we mentioned way back at the beginning, has studied these prognostics extensively. She notes that while we think of them as superstition, they were actually attempts at practical forecasting using the limited tools available. Medieval people were trying to predict and prepare for the future, just like we do. They simply had different methods. But the weather predictions were just the start. There were omens about death, disease, war, and famine, and some of them are genuinely unsettling. If you heard howling dogs on Christmas night, not just barking, but sustained, mournful howling, it meant death was coming to your household within the year. Multiple sources mention this. The howling was believed to be the dogs sensing spirits of the dead passing by, or possibly the approach of the wild hunt. If the first person to enter your house on Christmas morning was a woman, particularly a dark-haired woman, it was very bad luck. You'd face hardship in the coming year. This connects to the first-footing tradition we discussed, but with darker implications. In some regions, if the wrong person first-footed you, you could actually bar your door to everyone else for the rest of the day to prevent making it worse. If you heard bells ringing when there were no bells, phantom bells essentially, someone in your family would die before the year was out. There are numerous accounts of people claiming to hear these ghost bells during Christmas, and medieval sources treat these accounts seriously, recording them as genuine omens. Dreams during the 12 days were considered especially significant. Not just random neural firing, actual messages from God, or sometimes from darker sources. There were dream interpretation guides specifically for Christmas dreams. Dreaming of fire meant passion or anger in the coming year. Dreaming of water meant tears and sorrow. Dreaming of the dead, well, that usually meant the dead were actually trying to communicate with you. The Epiphany saga, which we mentioned in the context of Christmas Eve ghosts, has this remarkable passage about Christmas omens. A farmer dreams that the walls of his house are made of bones, and blood is dripping from the ceiling. He wakes terrified and tells his household. They all agree this is a terrible omen, and sure enough, by the end of winter, several people in that household have died from illness. Now, we could dismiss this as confirmation bias or self-fulfilling prophecy. But remember, these people had no other way to make sense of their world. No weather satellites, no medical science, no statistical analysis. Omens and prognostics were their way of imposing order on chaos, of feeling like they had some control or at least some warning about what was coming. And sometimes the omens were more than just interpretive. Sometimes they were encounters with actual supernatural beings. The folklore of the 12 days is filled with spirits, and not all of them are malevolent. Some are just present. The hidden folk, the fair folk, the good neighbours, all the euphemistic names for fairies, were believed to be especially active during Christmas. In Scandinavian tradition, there were the Yule lads, supernatural beings, sometimes described as trolls, sometimes as elves, who'd visit during the 13 days. They counted slightly differently. Each night one would arrive, and they had wonderfully specific behaviours. One would steal milk, one would slam doors, one would eat all the candles, one would sneak around, peeking through windows. Parents would tell children to leave out food for the Yule lads, and in return, the lads would leave small gifts, assuming the children had been good. If they'd been bad, they'd wake up to find a rotting potato in their shoe instead of a present. Sound familiar? This is another clear ancestor of the Santa Claus tradition. But the Yule lads had a mother, and she was genuinely terrifying. Grilla was her name, a giant troll woman who lived in the mountains and came down during Christmas specifically to hunt for naughty children. She'd catch them, stuff them in her sack, take them back to her cave, and cook them in a stew. This wasn't a metaphor. Parents genuinely threatened children with Grilla. Behave or Grilla will get you. And children genuinely feared her. There are accounts of children refusing to go outside during the Christmas season out of fear of being snatched by this child-eating monster. Iceland had particularly dark Christmas folklore, possibly because the winter there was so harsh, the darkness so complete, that people's imaginations filled it with terrors. We've already discussed Glama the Draugr, but there were other creatures too. The Yule cat, Jólakötturinn, was another Icelandic Christmas monster. This enormous cat would prowl during the 12 days, and it would eat anyone who hadn't received new clothes for Christmas. The logic was that this encouraged people to finish their wool processing and weaving before Christmas. There was a practical purpose. But the image of a gigantic supernatural cat hunting people who are too poor to afford new clothes is genuinely horrifying. Across Europe there were variations of this folklore. In Germany they had Frau Perchta, or Berchta, a witch-like figure who'd roam during the 12 days checking on households. If you'd been industrious, if your house was clean, if you'd honoured the proper rituals, she'd leave you a small gift, maybe a coin. But if you'd been lazy, if your spinning wasn't done, if you'd violated Christmas traditions, she'd slit your belly open and stuff it with straw and rocks. Again, this wasn't metaphorical. Medieval texts describe Perchta as a real entity that people genuinely feared encountering. There are accounts of people claiming to have seen her, describing her as having one large foot, from working the spinning wheel, one eye larger than the other, and a nose that was either hooked like a bird's or long and straight like a sword, depending on the region. In the British Isles, there was a tradition of the devil himself being abroad during Christmas. Not constantly, but at specific moments, especially midnight on Christmas Eve and Twelfth Night. If you were out alone at these times, you might encounter him, and the encounter could take various forms. Sometimes he'd appear as a handsome gentleman, well-dressed, offering to escort you home. Only his feet would give him away, cloven hooves instead of human feet. If you accepted his company, you'd be led astray, possibly killed, your soul claimed. Other times he'd appear as a black dog, the black shuck of East Anglia, or similar spectral hounds in other regions. These dogs were enormous, sometimes described as being the size of calves, with eyes that glowed red or sometimes blue. Seeing one was an omen of death. Being chased by one was certain doom. There are documented accounts, I mean actual written records from medieval times, of people claiming to have encountered these supernatural black dogs during Christmas. Coroner's reports mention them. Church records reference them. People took this seriously. And then there were the ghostly processions, different from the wild hunt, though related. These were visions of armies marching through the sky, or ships sailing through clouds, or funeral processions of people dressed in white. They'd appear suddenly during the 12 days, witnessed by multiple people, and then vanish. What's fascinating is that these weren't just individual hallucinations. There are accounts of entire villages seeing the same phantom procession. In 1181, I know this is technically High Middle Ages, but the tradition dates back much earlier. There's a chronicler who records that on Christmas Eve, people across several towns in England saw an army of the dead marching through the air. Hundreds of witnesses, all describing the same thing. Modern explanations might involve mass psychology, aurora borealis, unusual cloud formations. But medieval people had no such explanations. To them, this was real. The dead were marching. Heaven or hell or purgatory had opened just enough for the living to glimpse what lay beyond. The Church's position on all this was complicated. Officially, they condemned belief in fairies, trolls, elves, and other pagan spirits. These were either demons in disguise or superstitious nonsense. Dreams were just dreams, not messages. Omens were meaningless. Only proper Christian prayer and ritual had real power, but unofficially. Many clergy believed in these things too, or at least hedged their bets. There are numerous accounts of priests performing exorcisms on houses that were supposedly haunted during Christmas, of bishops blessing fields to protect against Perchta or similar entities, of Christmas services specifically designed to ward off evil spirits. And the common people, they absolutely believed. For them, the supernatural world was as real as the physical world, just usually invisible. And Christmas was when those two worlds overlapped most completely. This belief shaped behaviour. People hung iron over their doors during Christmas. Iron was believed to repel fairies and evil spirits. They avoided going out alone after dark. They performed protective rituals passed down through generations. They left offerings for entities they hoped wouldn't harm them. It created this atmosphere of wonder and terror mixed together. Christmas was joyful, yes, a time of feasting and celebration, but it was also dangerous. The darkness held real threats. The line between the living and the dead was thin. At any moment you might see something that would confirm your deepest supernatural beliefs, or traumatize you for life. And here's what strikes me most about all this. It made medieval people's experience of reality fundamentally different from ours. We live in a world that's been disenchanted, drained of magic. We know, or think we know, that ghosts aren't real, that fairies don't exist, that dreams are just neurons firing randomly. But medieval people lived in an enchanted world, a world that was full of invisible presences, of signs and omens, of supernatural dangers and blessings. Every shadow might hide something, every sound might mean something. The world was alive with meaning, with mystery, with genuine magic. And Christmas was when that enchantment was at its most powerful, when the veil was thinnest, when anything, absolutely anything might happen. So as we reach the end of our journey through Dark Ages Christmas, as we prepare to return to the ordinary world, we need to understand that for medieval people, this wasn't just a holiday. It wasn't just a break from work or an excuse to party. It was a genuine crossing into another reality, a different way of being, a time when they lived in a world that was more real, more meaningful, more magical than the everyday world they inhabited the rest of the year. And when Epiphany arrived, when the 12 days ended, they didn't just return to work. They returned to a smaller, dimmer, less enchanted existence. An existence that was necessary, that had to be endured, but that was fundamentally less alive than what they'd just experienced. Which brings us to our final question. What did medieval Christmas mean? What was the point of all this? The feasting, the chaos, the inversions, the supernatural terror. What did it do for these people, and what can it teach us now, 1,000 years later, about the human need for celebration, for transformation, for brief glimpses of a better, wilder, more magical world? The morning of January 7th must have felt strange. After 12 days of chaos, after the masks came off, and the Lord of Misrule surrendered his crown, after the last of the wassail was drunk and the final carol was sung, what then? How do you return to being a serf after you've commanded a lord? How do you bow to authority after you've mocked it? How do you accept the rigid hierarchy of medieval life after you've lived, however briefly, in a world where that hierarchy could be inverted? The answer is, you don't. Not completely. And maybe that was the whole point. Let me tell you about Plough Monday. This was the first Monday after Epiphany, the official day when agricultural work resumed after the Christmas break. And medieval people didn't just quietly return to their ploughs. They made a ceremony of it, one last bit of controlled chaos before normal life reasserted itself completely. Young men would decorate a plough with ribbons and flowers, whatever greenery they could find in January, which wasn't much. They'd drag this plough through the village, stopping at each house to demand money or food or ale. Sometimes they'd be pulling an actual plough. Other times it would be a symbolic one, lighter and easier to move. And if someone refused to contribute, the young men would plough up their front garden or doorstep. Actually plough it, destroying whatever was there. It was aggressive, it was destructive, it was technically vandalism, but it was also expected part of the tradition. A final assertion that the power dynamics of Christmas hadn't entirely dissipated yet. There was another tradition on Plough Monday, or sometimes the day after, called St. Distaff's Day, that's even more revealing. This was when gender warfare erupted into the open. Men would try to set fire to women's flax. The raw plant fibre women would spin into thread. Not enough to actually destroy it, just enough to singe it, to be annoying and threatening. And women would retaliate by dousing men with water, soaking them until they were drenched and miserable. Historians describe this as comic battles between the sexes, which is a polite way of saying that gender tensions that had been building all year, that had been briefly released during Christmas misrule, were now being played out in one final explosion of ritualized conflict before everyone had to cooperate again for the long year ahead. Think about what this reveals. Medieval society was under enormous strain. The hierarchy was oppressive. The inequality was extreme. Gender relations were fraught. The work was endless and exhausting, and people knew it. They felt it every day. Christmas didn't fix these problems. 12 days of feasting and freedom couldn't change the fundamental structure of medieval life. But it did something equally important. It proved that things could be different. It demonstrated that the social order wasn't natural or inevitable. It gave people a lived experience of alternative possibilities. When that peasant commanded the Lord, when that child gave orders to adults, when that servant girl became queen of the bean, those weren't just games. They were lessons, teachings, proof that power was conditional, temporary, ultimately a performance that could be suspended. And every year that lesson was reinforced. Every Christmas for 12 days the world turned upside down, and then it turned back, yes, but the memory remained. The knowledge that inversion was possible lingered in the body, in the mind, in the collective consciousness of the community. Some historians argue this was precisely why medieval authorities, both church and state, allowed and even encouraged these Christmas traditions. Not despite their subversive nature, but because of it. By creating a controlled space for inversion, they prevented uncontrolled rebellion. By giving people a taste of freedom, they made subjugation more bearable. Christmas was the steam valve that kept medieval society from exploding. Other historians push back against this interpretation. They point out that Christmas customs were genuinely subversive, that authorities constantly tried to control and limit them, that the traditions persisted despite official disapproval, not because of official encouragement. Christmas, in this reading, was an act of cultural resistance, a way for common people to assert their dignity and humanity in a system designed to deny both. The truth, as usual, is probably somewhere in between. Christmas served multiple purposes simultaneously. It was a safety valve and an act of resistance. It was authorized inversion and genuine rebellion. It was both conservative, preserving the social order by allowing temporary release, and radical, teaching people that hierarchy was constructed, not God-given. But beyond the politics, beyond the social function, there was something else happening during medieval Christmas. Something harder to quantify, but equally important. Medieval people were creating community. Real, deep, genuine community. When everyone sang together, when the rich and poor shared food, when the masks came off to reveal your neighbour's laughing face, when the supernatural terror turned out to be local boys playing pranks. In all of this, people were connecting across the boundaries that usually separated them. For 12 days, the blacksmith and the knight were just people celebrating together. The nun and the merchant's wife were just voices in the same carol. The child and the elder were just participants in the same dance. Identity became fluid. Connection became possible. And in those moments of genuine connection, people glimpsed something that medieval life usually denied them, the possibility of human equality. Not economic equality, that would have been unthinkable, but spiritual and emotional equality. The recognition that underneath all the roles and ranks and rituals, we're all just humans trying to survive winter, trying to find meaning, trying to experience joy before death comes for us. That's what medieval Christmas offered. Not escape from reality, but entrance into a deeper reality. Not fantasy, but truth. The truth that hierarchy is artificial, that joy is possible even in suffering, that community can bridge any divide, that humans have the power to create meaning and magic through ritual and celebration. The feast wasn't just about food. It was about abundance, about the promise that scarcity isn't eternal. The misrule wasn't just about chaos. It was about freedom, about the possibility of living differently. The supernatural beliefs weren't just superstition. They were enchantment, the insistence that this world contains more mystery and wonder than empirical observation can capture. The music wasn't just entertainment. It was communion. The experience of individual voices merging into something greater than themselves. All of it together created an experience that was genuinely transformative. For 12 days, medieval people lived in a different world, a world that was richer, wilder, more alive, more meaningful, more connected, more magical than the ordinary world of work and obligation and hierarchy. And when they returned to that ordinary world, they carried the memory with them, the knowledge that another way of being was possible, the experience of having lived it, the hope that it would come again. This is why Christmas persisted through centuries of change, why it survived the collapse of the Roman Empire, the chaos of the Dark Ages, countless plagues and famines and wars, why it adapted and evolved but never disappeared. Because people needed it, not wanted, needed this annual reminder of their humanity, needed this proof that joy could coexist with suffering, needed this experience of transformation, however temporary. And here's the remarkable thing, we still need it. the specifics have changed. We're not feasting on peacock or wearing goat masks or electing kings of the bean. We don't believe in trolls stealing our children or phantom armies in the sky. We've lost most of the traditions I've described tonight, but the core needs that medieval Christmas addressed, the need for community, for transformation, for meaning, for magic, for brief escape from ordinary constraints, those haven't changed. We still hunger for connection in an atomized world. We still long for wonder in a disenchanted age. We still need moments when the usual rules don't apply, when we can be more and different than our everyday selves. Medieval Christmas in the Dark Ages was extraordinary, stranger, wilder, more intense than anything we experience today. But it was responding to needs that are fundamentally human, timeless, universal. They gathered in the darkness because darkness surrounded them, and they needed to create light. They sang together because isolation threatened to break them, and they needed to feel connection. They inverted hierarchies because oppression wore them down, and they needed to remember their dignity. They told stories of supernatural beings because life was mysterious and frightening, and they needed those mysteries to have meaning. We might not face the same literal darkness, the same physical cold, the same immediate threats, but we face our own versions of these challenges, our own darkness, our own isolation, our own hierarchies that diminish us, our own mysteries that frighten us. And maybe, just maybe, there's something we can learn from how our ancestors met these challenges. Not by returning to medieval practices, obviously, but by recognizing what they understood, that humans need ritual, need celebration, need community, need transformation, need sacred time set apart from ordinary time, need moments when we can be more fully ourselves by temporarily being something other than ourselves. The Dark Ages weren't dark because people lacked knowledge or sophistication. They were dark because of material hardship, political chaos, genuine suffering. But in that darkness, people created something luminous. They created Christmas, a celebration that was simultaneously sacred and profane, reverent and raucous, structured and chaotic, terrifying and joyful. They created 12 days when the impossible became possible, when the spiritual world pressed close to the material world, when the lowest could become highest and the highest could become lowest, when everyone, regardless of rank or status, could participate in something transcendent. And then, on January 7th, they went back to their ordinary lives. They picked up their tools, they returned to their work, they re-entered the hierarchy. The peasant bowed to the Lord again. The servant obeyed the master. The child quieted before the adult. But they remembered. Oh, they remembered. They'd lived a different way, however briefly. They'd experienced a different world. And that memory sustained them through the long, cold, dark months ahead, until the cycle could begin again next December. That's the legacy of medieval Christmas, not the specific customs, most of which are lost to us now, but the understanding that humans need these moments of transformation, need these celebrations that acknowledge both our suffering and our joy, our limitations and our possibilities, our earthbound nature and our transcendent aspirations. As you drift off to sleep tonight, in the warm comfort of your bed, I want you to imagine yourself back there, in a small dwelling in the year 800, huddled with your family around a fire. Outside, the winter wind howls. Inside, a Yule log burns, casting dancing shadows on the walls. You're exhausted from celebrating. Your stomach is full for the first time in weeks. Your voice is hoarse from singing, and you're surrounded by people, family, neighbours, even people from different social classes than you, all connected through the shared experience of these 12 extraordinary days. You know tomorrow the ordinary world returns, but tonight, right now, you're living in a different reality, a reality where magic is real, where hierarchy can be challenged, where community overcomes division, where joy is possible even in the depths of winter. That was Christmas in the Dark Ages, not the sanitized, commercialized version we know today, but something rawer, stranger, more powerful, something that spoke to the deepest human needs and offered, however temporarily, genuine fulfillment of those needs. Thank you for spending these hours with me, traveling back to a world that's foreign and familiar at the same time, a world that's gone, but that left echoes we still hear in our own celebrations, our own rituals, our own hunger for meaning and connection and transformation. I hope these stories linger with you. I hope they change, even slightly, how you think about celebration, about community, about the deep human needs that rituals serve. And I hope they remind you that our ancestors, living in circumstances we can barely imagine, created something beautiful and meaningful out of darkness and hardship. If this journey through medieval Christmas has sparked something in you, curiosity, wonder, recognition, I'd love to hear about it. Leave a comment, share your thoughts. Tell me which tradition surprised you most, which stories stayed with you, what connections you see between their world and ours, and if you enjoyed this deep dive into history, if you appreciate these long-form explorations of the past, well, there are so many more stories waiting to be told, so many other aspects of medieval life, of human history, that we could explore together in the same depth, with the same care for detail and meaning. So rest well tonight. Dream of Yule logs and wassail bowls, of mummers and carols, of a world where 12 days could change everything and nothing, where celebration was serious business, where darkness was fought with light and song and stubborn human joy. And I'll see you next time when we'll embark on another journey into the fascinating, strange, deeply human past. Sweet dreams and good night.